what I'm about to do now, which is say, hey, let's turn to today's topic and to our So let me give you a little background, Gene. So this is the Kenneth Smith seminar, and it's been going on for some years now. This one is called Millennia and Microcosm. We've been going for 142 weeks. Hi, Munzer. Welcome to the call. We've been going for 142 weeks so far, plus a certain number of misses where we didn't meet. And Millennia and Microcosm is a book by philosopher Kenneth Smith that David and I are working on typesetting and publishing. Kenneth wrote it in the 1998 to 2000 time frame. Well, everybody was nervous about the turn of the millennium and Y2K. He said, well, how about using this as an opportunity to take a retrospective on the last couple thousand years of European history and culture, and let's see if what can we learn about who we are today by looking at how we saw the world differently in the ancient epoch and in the medieval epoch. And then if we can learn to see through their eyes a little bit, then we can turn their eyes on our own epoch, and maybe we can see ourselves in a new way. And the premise for this is that idea of, we don't know who discovered water, but we know it's not a fish. Being moderns, we're the least qualified to talk about what modernity is, because we're in it all the time. We don't have any basis for contrast. So the exercise of the book is to try to learn how to look at the world a little bit like the ancients did, and then to learn how to look at the world a little bit like the medievals did, so that we can get some distance from modernity and turn around and look at it from those perspectives. So where we are in the book is we're in chapter 6. It's the second chapter about the medieval epoch. There's going to be, I don't know, 8 or 9 chapters about the medieval epoch. There was only one about the ancient epoch, chapter 4, and that's because Kenneth has taught ancient philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, so many times that he was able to compress down the equivalent amount of material, 8 or 9 chapters, into just one chapter. But it was a very dense chapter. We spent 2 years deconstructing all his references to other philosophers and writers, and what is he talking about here. So it's only the last several months we've been into the medieval epoch. Chapter 5, which was the first chapter about the medieval epoch, was mostly about contrasting the medieval period with the ancient period. So it was sort of hitting all the big juicy points of meaning and priority for the medievals, and showing how revolutionary those ideas were compared to the ancient or classical ideas. That they were really overturning the value system of the ancients on every major part of its foundation. In chapter 6, also the other thing about chapter 5 to know is that it was not focused on the whole breadth of medieval thought by any means. It was focused right down the center on the sort of what was the orthodox position that was being enforced by the powers that be, by the papacy, by the clergy, by kings and armies. What was it that if you didn't believe this, they were going to put you to the stake and burn you? And so chapter 5 really kind of focuses on some of those ideas. But chapter 6, speaking of dialectics and palintropies, focuses on the other part of the dialectic, which is that the medieval epoch, although it was theoretically centered on this concept of religious genocide, that if we can exterminate all other religions and just have the one perfect pure religion, then we'll have peace on earth. And then we won't have evil anymore, because all the kings will do what God says, and therefore they'll be just and noble kings ruling by divine right. This was the framework that justified the medieval revolution. But the medieval epoch isn't only defined by that official framework. It's also defined by the enormous number of spiritualists who sprouted up around the periphery of the medieval world: monks, nuns, holy men, visionaries. There's all these people deviated from the official position and explored, the teachings of Jesus and spirituality, and sometimes they did cross-religious investigations. You get Jewish Christian dialogue going on, you get Jewish Muslim dialogue, you get Jewish Christian dialogue. There's all these ways in which people on the peripheries of the medieval world are innovating like crazy. There's this great ferment going on, this spiritual ferment, and this great creativity. And that's what chapter 6 is starting to talk about. It opens up with a bunch of quotes from William Blake, who's modern, but he's definitely from the spiritual tradition rather than the Orthodox tradition. And then we're only as far as paragraph 3 in here, but we're really starting to explore this counter movement of, if what we saw in chapter 5 is the official, the cross or the sword, believe it or will kill you position. Then chapter 6 starts to get into but what is the genuine spirituality that's on tap, that's available, that's being explored by people throughout this 1,000-year period we're talking about, roughly 500 to 1,500, more or less. So that's the background. And we'll be, over the course of the next year and a half, we'll be working our way through these medieval chapters. Our standard format is that we use the text as a jumping off point and as a through line. So we keep coming back to the text, but then we arc out into our own experiences. Phil will talk about art or music. With Sharon, we can talk about medical ethics. Everybody's bringing something to the picture to kind of round out and explore these ideas, because the way that Kenneth writes is he's not a systematizer, and he's not a literalist. He's an existentialist philosopher. So he's trying to talk not about how does he think his system works and we should all believe his system, but rather, naturally, according to nature, how do we actually work? And that means there's a long process of discovery. There's room for error. You need a lot of different perspectives to get a good view of reality. And so in his writing, he's constantly alluding to Dostoevsky, Hegel, Kierkegaard, Heraclitus, you name it. He's constantly alluding to other writers and artists and so on. And that's why we're taking our time with the text. Whenever we see an allusion like that, we go explore that person. What did that person have to say? What have we learned from elsewhere that could be relevant, and so on. So that explains the pace. That's why we're taking our time going through the book. So I hope that background helps a little bit. At any point, obviously 142 weeks into this, there's some of us we're carrying a lot of assumptions and shared vocabulary. So we'll try to foreground that stuff whenever we notice it, and feel free to ask questions at any point. We do hands, and there always comes a point in about 2 hours in where mostly we're not doing the text anymore. Mostly we're going through the hands and the different comments that people have. I'm just going to drop a little bit more text in here. So there's the link. I'm going to post that again because Munzer joined after I posted it. So let me post it again. There's the link to the chapter 6, which is where we are. And you can see the text there. And let's see, give me a second here. Okay, so let me paste some of the text that's kicking us off. These are little groups of sentences from paragraph 3, and I'm just dropping them right in there for us to take a look at, and then I'll start with the hands. But I want to start by getting the parts of paragraph 3 in there for us to look at. We talked a little bit about sentences 1 through 2, and maybe a little about 3 through 5, but not as much. So that's really where we're gonna be starting our focus today after we get through the initial Q&A. And then here's the rest of the paragraph, which we didn't look at last week. And it needs some discussion. There's some issues, especially in sentences 6 and 7. But we'll come to that. Let's start with Stephen. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, yeah, that word palintopy, Google's spitting it out, so it could be a typo.
Yes, it's not an English word. I coined it. And
Oh,
I coined it from the Greek. So I'll share the original quote here, translated. Here's Heraclitus, as translated by Philip Reelwright. He says, people do not understand how that which is at variance with itself also agrees with itself, semicolon. There is a harmony in the bending back. And that's where the Greek is palintropos, the bending back, as in the case of the bow and the lyre.
palintropus, okay. You might have
Palintropos.
left the R out of the original.
Yeah, so I'm doing what often happens when we take a Greek word and bring it into English. So it's palintropy would be the English equivalent of palintropos, the bending back. And this palintropos that Heraclitus is talking about, this goes to the heart of the thing that Hegel tried over and over and struggled to explain as his dialectic. Um, as we've said before on these calls, one of the interesting things about Hegel's dialectic is that when you mention Hegel's dialectic, everyone goes, "Oh, you mean thesis, antithesis, synthesis," and that's how I learned it originally. But as the Walter Kaufmann translation of Hegel says, Hegel detested the use.
I'm just wondering, you sure you got that spelling?
Well, there's an R missing. It should be
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's the problem I was having, yeah.
polyntropy. So Hegel detested the use of thesis, antithesis, synthesis as a summation of his dialectic. He says that's Kant's dialectic. And Kant's dialectic is like a cage match where you take any two things, you throw them in a cage, you make them fight, and somehow through some mystical transformation, a synthesis comes out. And he says that's just arbitrary. Hegel basically says that's arbitrary intellectual garbage. It's like the world is not a big cage match of that. No, it's not the case that any two things put together naturally produce a synthesis. Hegel said the better description of what Hegel's dialectic was is the bud, the blossom, and the fruit. He's got a footnote in the Phenomenology of Geist, which Walter Kaufmann says is one of the few places where Hegel stops writing in an intellectually dry fashion and starts writing in a beautiful, stylistic, elusive fashion. And it's a great line. It,
Okay, where was Marx on that one? Because he utilised that one, didn't he?
yes, yes. Marx. Pretty much all of the young Hegelians, Marx, Hegel, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and the others, they all make this change with Hegel away from, they may use the language thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but they really move away from that idea that anything can be combined, and they move into this notion of stages of development, which is what Hegel's dialectic is that things are in conflict not for some arbitrary reason, but because that's how growth happens. That you unfold new order from within yourself using the ancient Greek concept. You've got this character. The character has these different fountains of order. They don't always agree with each other. Sometimes they conflict with each other, but there's a creation that happens through that destruction. The Greeks talk about this. And through that creation, you transform and you become different than you were before. Aliosis is the Greek term, othering. We are always in a state of mutating into some new form. And Hegel's trying to capture that development. He's saying rather than just arbitrary, dry, I'll pick any two things and throw them together and expect a synthesis to come out. He says where syntheses come from is it's how we grow and develop over time, how a child develops new capabilities, but the new capabilities are often at odds with the previous capabilities, and there's a struggling period where they can't decide if they're going to let go of who they were before and totally try to embrace who they want to become, or did they throw out the baby with the bathwater when they entered the new stage of development and now they're dissatisfied and later they have to go back and capture what was lost and create a new synthesis. So all these things that happen through the process of growth, this is what Hegel's talking about in his dialectic. What Hegel's trying to do is get out of the realm of abstract ideas and enter the realm of nature. How do the ideas actually manifest in the real world? And he says the way they actually manifest is through stages of development. Marx just takes that wholesale, just exactly the way it is. But then his obsession is that he focuses on the economy to the exclusion of most other things. That's his particular flavor of neo-Hegelianism. Whereas,
Okay, and now this other point, Kenneth Smith as the existentialist.
yes,
So in the end, what is existentialism in a paragraph?
the one sentence version, and I'm quoting Kenneth Smith. Donald knows this quote really well. Kenneth says, "All philosophy is either idealist or existentialist." So there's people who are out there being systematizers saying, "Well, I wish that the world worked this way, so I'm going to insist that it does, and I expect you all to follow me." And then there's existentialists who say, "I didn't invent the world. It's not mine to dictate terms to. I need to investigate the world and try to learn how it works." And
Okay,
everything you can
it's a
learn
bit
is,
like realism, isn't it? Because realism's the opposite of idealism.
yeah, you can think of it as idealism, as realism, but you have to be cautious because idealists all call themselves realists. They
Yeah,
say,
I've
"I'm
noticed that.
really describing how it really is." Uh,
Yes, yes. So a great tendency to call themselves realists. Now, this is
yeah.
Schelling. This is a thing which seemed to have kicked it off. Schelling was doing his 1840 lectures, the ones which Engels was present. and then Kierkegaard was present. And he was making this big point that don't forget, when he was criticizing Hegel, actually, he was saying, don't forget that reality precedes our ideas about it.
Yes, that's
And
the existentialist
there's this
tradition.
huge tendency amongst philosophers, they get so caught up in their ideas
That's right.
that they think their ideas precede reality.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Those are great questions, Stephen. And that really helps to give a crash course in some of the core ideas we've been talking about. So palentropy, this is kind of what Jean was talking about earlier, and that I got excited about because I recognized what she was saying. This we coined the term, but we really are just borrowing it from the Greek, and we're borrowing it from the Greek because Heraclitus in this fragment says it better than we normally see it, which is this idea that contradiction contradiction in logic is used to prove that something's false. If it leads to a contradiction, then it can't be true. But Heraclitus says, but when we study nature, we see paradoxes all over the place. And they're true. They're true paradoxes. The world really often does contain opposites within the same truth. And any logic that's not able to handle that is inadequate to the task of describing nature. So Heraclitus struggles with images like you can't step in the same river twice and so forth to try to give us metaphors and pictures to help us deal with that the river can be, but also be changing at the same time, which, it's remained a great struggle for thousands of years. How do you reconcile change?
Well, I was telling Phil that he couldn't go to the same bus stop and catch the same bus
Yes.
again.
Yes. Might be a different driver tomorrow. The bus might have a brake line that's broken since yesterday. I mean, who knows, right? You might have to sit next to the guy who hasn't had a bath today. Yesterday was a nice day, and today is like, oh dear God, you don't know what the day's going to bring you. So
Which will sort of undermine the entire basis of our economy, of course,
yes,
because no one can get to work anymore. They won't get to the same workplace.
that's right. You can't go to the same workplace anymore, or can you? Yeah, it's that quote that some people think Heraclitus didn't say, and maybe one of his students said, which is, into the same rivers we step and do not step, we are and are not. And it's just really just jamming us right into the paradox and saying it's both true at the same time. The river changes and it's also still there.
So am I still the same person that woke up yesterday, or am I a new one?
Yes and no. Same and different. It's like the ship of Theseus, right? We replace a different rotting board every day, and eventually there's no boards left. Is it the same ship? Yes and no. And Heraclitus is fine with yes and no. And the existentialist tradition is fine with yes and no. It's like, this is, we expect to be walking on solid ground, but instead we're walking on a field of paradoxes.
Okay, great. So if I'm being chased by savage rationalists, I only have to throw that quote back. They'll look at it and their heads will explode after a little while.
You can expect some exploding heads for sure. Thank you, Stephen. Gene, you've had your hand up. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
It this is just a quick, I'm new here. I can't participate, that well, but this is just a 30-second thing. Firstly, since this has been going on for so long, I would be interested if anybody cares to share. Maybe they could just, fit it in their shares if they're interested in doing so, or when the subject comes up, in what people have learned from this lengthy inquiry, and in what ways people have changed, if anyone cares to share that, because obviously you've gone really deep. And the second thing is the concept about bending back. Is this every week, the seminar?
It is.
Okay, I'm going to have to leave early today because I have a medical appointment, but I will come every week. But I would be interested, just this bending back concept is an example. If anybody, I think it's expressed verbally a little somewhat archaically. It could be expressed in a different language, but if anybody would be interested in experimenting during the week with one's own functioning on what that bending back could mean and how it works, and difficulties or successes with it, with that kind of experimentation and observation, and wants to share it next week, I would love to hear that. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. I've been toying with the idea of creating a Discord server as a companion to this call. And the Discord server we could use to talk about the things we talked about, between sessions. And we could do the sorts of things you're talking about where, we reflect back on, what do these concepts mean to us and so forth. If you'd be interested. You're on mute. You got to come off mute again. Oh, you're still muted. You got to find your mute button.
Okay. Just quickly, I was thinking just about these meetup groups I've been going to. I think that people are getting out of touch with the generative aspect of communicating through writing.
Yes.
And I just don't know why people don't start some kind of email group. Because
Yeah.
the person could read it, easy to do, can think about it, can put quotes on there. And if they don't want to read it, they don't have to.
Yes.
So I was thinking of that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Yeah, Kenneth Smith ran an email group for, was it a decade, Donald? And then sometime after that, you got to come off mute, Donald. Nope, you're still muted.
Okay. I have a lot back till 2011. And I think it was before that, and somehow I've lost the email records. I still have headers, but not bodies.
Yes.
Because of changes and stuff. So I think it went on probably from about 2000 or the 90s. I don't know. 25 years. I have gigabytes of stuff. And if I wish Jean would have been here last week when I said that this awoke me from my dogmatic slumbers. How did it change my life? The same way Hume changed Kant. I don't know. No. I don't know. All right. Yes, this has gone on, for a long time.
Yeah.
I will say something else. If you
please, as long as you're.
I'm going to see Kenneth in a couple of weeks.
Are you?
Yeah, I got a hold of him. David, I talked with David about how to contact him for sure. I'm going on a trip to see other relatives, but I'm going through Austin, so I'm going to see Kenneth.
That's fantastic.
You want me to buy a box of books for you while I'm there? I'm sure I'll be buying one for me.
He's got a box of books for me. You know he does.
And anyway.
Yes.
Enough.
When you visit, send him all our love and mischief.
But yeah, I wish, he didn't have really a proper software list server for that email group. And it was, the managing of it, I think, was tough.
Yeah.
Hard, whereas a true list server would have cut his effort down greatly.
Yes.
But the only one I knew about at the time ran on Multics, and there was no way he was going to operate a Multics mainframe. But
yeah, no.
so I agree. I somewhat agree with Jean that having all that stuff written, people tend to organize their thoughts.
Yeah.
In writing, and are more careful about their arguments. Yeah. And he did do that for 25 years at least, I think.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Donald. Yeah, I knew Donald would need to speak up on that because yeah, Donald had a more complete archive than I had, and he helped David and I get a complete list of all the emails, which we now have, and at some point maybe we can get that all loaded onto Discord and turn it into a historical server that picks up, that has all of the previous discussion, and then maybe we would pick up with just new discussions that we would have as a group. But we'll see. It's going to take some doing to work out. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Let's fix that. There we go. I guess I got to respond to the topic at hand first. I am a huge fan of the Discord option, or I don't think I have a vote, but I have a say that my voice says, yes, I'm in favor of this, and I would very much benefit from it. But I know that in general, it's Discord, like anything else, or written, requires extra effort. And to answer Gene's question, at least from my specific point of view, is that writing things down takes a lot more effort and a lot more care and a lot more learning. But at the same time, there's a lot more benefit because you're so well organized. People don't want that because it takes too much. I mean, it also requires a lot more attention, and people have a significantly diminished attention. But the other thing I was going to answer, Gene, about what I've learned in this, I can sum up from a totally unexpected point of view, which is probably not exactly what she wants to hear, but hopefully anyways. What I learned about this is Rick loves to laugh, and everywhere in general, I find, likes to have a lot of fun in this meetup group, and I think it's probably the best thing about it, that keeps us sustaining a lot of enthusiasm. And the other thing from a substantive point of view that I've learned from this being here for, I don't know, maybe, I actually don't know how long I've been here. I've only been here for like 30 to 50 weeks, so it's at most 1/3 of the total time that you guys have been running the seminar. But I think that a good way to frame it up is something that Rick said in the introduction, is that we cover a myriad of perspectives that all add a dimensionality to the substance that we're trying to learn, and it brings into focus the being of these ideas in a much more robust and creative way than I'm usually experiencing in life. And it's also, the confirmation bias here is it's what I like most in life, when there's a rich multidimensional aspect of different languages and perspectives, and they're all essentially like a palantropos. They're bringing each other into being by having certain differences. And then lastly, the real point that I wanted to talk about, that I don't want to talk for too long, but I'm with Stephen here, that you've been saying palantropy for a long time, and I went up and looked it up, and I'm like, there's no such thing as palantropy anywhere in existence. And so I had a nice conversation with ChatGPT about this, and it helped me figure out exactly that it's palantropos. I'm probably pronouncing that terribly, but that's the way it sounds in English to me as a California guy. And ChatGPT says it's two words. You have palin or palin, which is a back, again, or in return, and tripo, which means to turn or to change. And it says that Heraclitus, when talking about this, is again talking about a river that or he says the bow or the lyre as well. But the other one is the river. It's a river that flows in both directions, which again doesn't really happen. But you do have, if you ever go whitewater rafting, you have these eddies, these places where the river does go back in on itself. And so it has these circular sort of, literally like, I'm trying to think, whirlpools that are generated by the flow in one direction and the other. And I was thinking that, like, this reminds me of what I don't know, it's maybe Hegelian, but in general, it's a very natural approach, is where I first learned about this that changed my whole life. I was younger, I was like in 10th grade learning chemistry, and from a really advanced, amazing chemist who was, of all things, like a refugee from Russia. And she was like a great professor in a university, but because her whatever credentials didn't translate, I got her as a high school teacher, and she was just magical. And she would talk about these ideas, and similarly, like a palantropos, she'd talk about the idea of light and how it has multi dimensions. If you imagine an object like a pyramid, but you put it over a two-dimensional like projector, I think we all know what a projector is. If you lay it on one side, it looks like a triangle. If you lay it the other way, it has a square. And essentially, the square aspect of it and the triangle aspect of it bring it into being. They bring each other into being. So this is what what I've understood as reciprocal causality. And it's like two things that oppose each other have serious contradictions, but so they unite in a higher dimensional space, literally more ideas. Like in this case, in math and physics, geometry, you can just have a higher dimensional space, create a higher dimensional object, and then they don't contradict each other. But if you reduce it down to the lower dimensional object, then it does contradict each other. And I was thinking about Theseus' ship. I thought of this for a long time. The ship itself, unlike your bus, is always changing. The bus station is always changing. The molecules and the particles in this, like a chemistry, it's called a dynamic equilibrium. There's particles moving in and out of this all the time. Nothing's ever the same. And in fact, it's never it's at even any static point. There's never an actual thing there. But the dynamic equilibrium is like, if you think of like, I don't know, a simple system where you have like water on one side and gas on the other, that as you have more gas, the gas causes itself to turn into air. And then the air, because there's more gas, turns itself back into water. And so these two things, they bring each other into being. And if there's more of one, it causes the other to be shifted towards. The equilibrium shifts in that direction. And I was thinking very much like a river or the bow or the lyre in this case, all do these things where they have these tensions like a relationship where they bring each other into being through the space between them and their interactions between them. But the object itself is never actually static, but the idea of the object is always static. And if you go to Theseus, this is an interesting idea here that we don't talk about so much. The idea is unchanging. You know, the ship that took you from on your journey to the back, or like me as a person, that I'm always the same person on the same journey. The idea of me is always the same and static and fixed. But the actual object that is bringing that idea into being is always changing. So this is where you're like stepping into the same river all the time, and at the same time you've never stepped in the same river once. And yeah, I love Phil for that one, is that you don't even step in the same river once, right? But this is again a great philanthropy and a great contradiction. But when you move it to that the river itself is both the idea of the river and the physical object of the river, you get a multi-dimensional perspective that then is not contradictory anymore.
Yes. Thank you, Ari.
I think that's a good place. Yeah, but I got to say that I was looking at philanthropy and it just didn't exist. So I love the idea of bringing this idea into existence.
Yes, yes. I had to coin it because we talk so much about the dialectic, and there's so many stages of the dialectic for which there's no English words. So I just decided to rip off Heraclitus. I shared there in the chat the original Greek as captured in the notes in the back of Philip Wheelwright's translation of Heraclitus, and then I have the transliteration into Latin letters, and then I have Wheelwright's translation there as well. And his book is from 1959. It's available for free from the Internet Archive. It's Kenneth Smith's favorite translation of Heraclitus. You can download it for free and have it as a PDF on your own laptop. Phil, would you mind? I know we only have Jean for a little bit before a medical appointment. She'd like to add something to what Ari just said. Would you mind if she cuts the line?
Go ahead.
Thank you. Actually, I'll be here till almost the end, but I have to be in the kitchen getting ready. Basically, I think that what the person who spoke, Ari, just said, it took a long time to say, there's flaws in that. There's truth in it. There's some kind of truth, but there's flaws in it because you're mainly, Ari, to me, you were mainly speaking about flow rather than harnessing. And flow is weaker. It's a different, we could equate flow to almost to grace, you know, if you're going to use a Christian concept. It's a weaker concept. Things don't just happen. That's, to me, that's a form of idealism. To change human functioning after the defense structure, the child creatively forms its defense structure, is literally next to impossible, in my opinion, but not impossible. And I'm not saying there shouldn't be a Discord server. I probably wouldn't be on it, but that's a kind of, because to me, that's the kind of thing, there's too much going on. People don't know how to focus on one subject and ponder it for a long time. So I probably wouldn't be on there, but there's no, I might try it one time, but it's just too much data coming in my opinion. And there's no reason why there couldn't be both an email list and a server. And I recommend the email list moving forward, or not moving forward, I'm sorry, I forget what it's called, IO. I forget what it's called, but I'll find out later next week. Why there's, but the concepts that you express are so, to me, if in all humbleness and respect, so simplistic and so one-sided. And no, it's hard to see that stuff because I'm really into the affect and the beauty, and I'm an artist, I'm a painter, I'm a alto sax player, all that shit just kept me from being a whole person. I'm not saying it's the same for anybody else, but we will use anything we can to not harness and to feel some uncomfortable feelings that the aim of the defense structure is never to feel. Okay, that's my humble opinion. Thank you. Thank you for letting me go.
Of course. Thank you, Jean. Yeah, it's one of the things that we talk about a lot in this is that philosophers in this existentialist tradition have a tendency to be confronting aspects of reality for which there isn't much good language. That it could be something fundamental to nature that's everywhere in nature and happens all the time, and still our language might not have a single word for it. And if we try to use an existing word for it, we find ourselves warping our understanding of reality to fit this other concept that isn't reality itself. And next thing we know, we've become systematizers and not instead of existentialists. So part of the reason why Ari's taking the tack that he is with this is we're trying to build up our vocabulary, a few words at a time, and that means that because our language lags so far behind the sophistication of the nature that we live in, it's like we're trying to talk about grad school level stuff, but the only vocabulary we have is kindergarten level vocabulary, and it's going to take us a while to build up the terms and therefore to be able to talk at a more sophisticated level about the full scale of things that we're dealing with. So I think we would all agree with you, Gene, about this. There's an enormous amount more that's going on, and that polyntropy is embraces far more sophisticated concepts than just flow. But it's just you can it's one of the things that Kenneth says in his writings about Heraclitus. He says you can see how Heraclitus is struggling with the Greek language because the Greek language was never designed to fully express these insights that he's got. And so he's sometimes he's coining terms, sometimes he's bending them to use them in ways they weren't meant to be used. But the thing he does above all is he's constantly trying to give us images and metaphors that evoke a larger part of nature and can do the work that the language is incapable of doing on its own. It needs those references. And the example we use is the finger pointing to the moon. It's like, yeah, the moon is this whole complicated thing, and if we don't have the language for it, at least we can point at it. And we get in trouble if people look at the finger and think that we're talking about the finger. But if they can look at the finger and turn and see which way it's pointing, they go, "Oh, the moon. Yeah, okay. Now I see what you're talking about. This whole complex array of sophisticated behaviors. I got it." But the words, couldn't possibly represent it directly. So, yeah. So Phil, go ahead. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was thinking, I guess back to almost the beginning. It seems like you could coin it as the relationship between uh, body and mind, one way, on metaphysics and ontology. It just seems to me that relationship between knowing and being is something that seemed to be very perplexing to society. And it seems to me the problem, it goes back to what I said, whether that's a hierarchical structure in which knowing is something that gives a form to being, or whether being is really a kind of knowing that's just distributive. Because your example of the the fruit, the blood, and the bud and the blossom. It's really it's on the one hand is emerging in the body structure itself, but on the other hand, there seems to be a formal structure, some kind of structure that's laying beneath it. For instance, I was using this metaphor in a Plato seminar, and you know, there's a teleology in that. And in other words, the acorn is destined to become an oak tree.
Mm-hmm.
That's its destiny. That's a form in itself. But of course, there's diversity within the acorn itself because depending what situation is in, if it, if the acorn is large between a crack and a stone, it's going to, bend and do things differently. a relationship, the physical structure that's in. In other words, the circumstances in. And it seems to me uh, it has both, but on the other hand, in the final analysis, it's a different kind of oak tree, but it's still an oak tree, you know? So therefore, there seems to be a destiny involved, despite the fact that there is a kind of a particular relationship to the tactical relationship that relates to the situation at hand. And so therefore, I'm breaking it down to the fact that, you know, if form is like a higher level kind of strategy, in a sense, you know, like the high command, like I'm using probably Tuckman's Guns of August, the high command has the form were all worked out, but the situation at hand, the field generals and the, you know, the field officers say, this is not turning out to be the way you planned it out to be, you know? And it took a while because high command was so stuck on the fact that we got it completely right. We figured everything out. It's got to be the way it was until it became very obvious it wasn't turning out the way it is. You know, like Michael Tyson says, you know, uh, the boxing goes well until you get hit in the face, and suddenly it changes everything. Okay, so then I'm thinking that's that the body actually in the situation actually it emerges in a sense a structure that on the one hand obeys a deep formal structure, but it emerges in its own way. It sounds a lot like Merleau-Ponty, you know, in a sense. So in some sense, you know, like the body in some sense caused the shot in a minute way. And my thinking, you know, strategic thinking and a little hierarchical thinking is because we have a limited consciousness, a limited understanding, and therefore we have to simplify it to a way that is like this is the structure, the form itself. And when you come down to it, all depends how the situation goes, you know, in some sense. And so last week I mentioned uh, Kashmir Malevich and how suprematism is very, very different from constructivism, which is like Vladimir Tatlin. Uh, because constructivism is based on the production at hand and the situation that evolves. And that is primary motive. And when you look at suprematism, on the surface, and most people misidentify, think of it as like, oh, it's a kind of constructivism. No, it isn't, because Malevich started as a symbolist. He believed that the construction is a representation of a deep symbol that's within the structure. And so therefore it's completely different. That's why I explained the relationship between perspective and expanding perspective is a completely different orientation. And so therefore, in a sense, you know, I think I myself personally believe that it's a relationship between strategy and tactics, but I actually believe that in some sense, a distributed formal structure is more realistic than a hierarchical structure. And you know, and that's the difference between, let's say, uh, uh, what's his name? God, uh, the uh, damn, these names I shouldn't forget. You know, I'm getting old.
Talk around
It's
it.
like
Right.
it's like you know the relationship between Picasso, who was in some ways a constructivist, but not really, and and uh, and the idealist. God.
Yeah.
Anyway,
It never works to directly confront the noun flight. You always have to go around it.
yeah. So in some sense, like you know, like I should have
Yeah, he'll come back.
And anyway, it seems like what happened was that that kind of structural relationship in which the forms emerge as you go by, it got consolidated into a system, which was very, very compelling in a sense. And so it formed a kind of a new kind of you would say new modernism, a late modernism, in which the structure of the forms took over. And that's why I kind of think of him as a Neoplatonist in some sense. All right, that's it.
Thank you, Phil. Dawson, welcome to the call. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me. I am new here.
Let me interrupt for a second.
Yeah,
Mondrian, the high priest of modernism. Mondrian versus Picasso. Okay, that's it, Phil. Go ahead. Sorry.
yeah. I have less of a comment, more of a question, since like I'm just kind of still navigating what everyone's talking about. But I kind of wanted to backtrack to earlier when you guys were mentioning the river example and how that was contradictory. However, is it not more paradoxical than it is contradictory? And then does what's his name? You guys mentioned Heraclitus. Does he view something that's contradictory not necessarily wrong? So that was kind of my question.
Those are great questions, Dawson. Yeah, so in formal logic, contradictions are explained as a flaw in the logic, and proof by contradiction is frequently used in mathematical proofs to try to demonstrate that an idea is false. But what's wrong with that from an existentialist perspective is that when we deal with nature, like Ari was saying, because of the limitations of the human perspective, things that are true and complex, when we try to boil them down into our simple perspectives, they often look contradictory to us. And Heraclitus, as a philosophy of nature, took a real interest in these kinds of paradoxes. And Heraclitus's line is that to mistake a paradox for a contradiction is a problem, because paradoxes are natural; they're a normal part of the truth. Like Ari said, the example that we use a lot in this seminar is the book Flatland. I don't know if you've ever read it. It's a very short novel, and it's from the perspective of a two-dimensional being that lives in a two-dimensional world. There isn't a third dimension. Everything is, and the guy who wrote it's a mathematician. He worked this all out in great detail. He describes how their houses work, how their locks work, how their doors work, and it's all flat. It's all two-dimensional. There's no third dimension. And then once he's got the reader comfortable with this, he then starts to have odd things happen that are natural in our three-dimensional world. They wouldn't seem odd to us, but when they happen to the two-dimensional people, they seem inexplicable. Like, for example, if you throw a baseball and it flies through the air, it's moving, right? Well, if that ball passes through a flatland world, then at first there's no ball at all, and then there's just a point, and then for no reason the point appears and it grows into a large circle, and then it shrinks back into a small circle, and then it vanishes as it passes through the plane. And to the people in flatland, this has no explanation. It came out of nowhere, and it went to nowhere. It's inexpressible. What the actual truth that's happening can't fit in the limited framework that the flatland people are trying to think in terms of. So the author of Flatland is using this as an example. This is what Ari was referring to, is he's using this as an example to get us to understand how there are many interesting, true, powerful things in the cosmos that when we try to fit those things into our very limited language, they just look to us like contradictions. Whereas Heraclitus puts it in his stuff as paradoxes. Like, so you're stepping into the river, but the waters keep changing that you're stepping in. So is it the same river or is it not the same river? And then a later follow-up quote says, you yourself are also changing, right? You're inhaling and exhaling, your blood is flowing, cells are dividing and making new cells. You're becoming a new person, even in the act of stepping in and stepping out of the water. So it's not only the river that's flowing, but you too are flowing. And your understanding of the world, you step in the water, it's a sunny day, you think it's going to be warm, you forgot this is a mountain stream, and the shock of the incredible numbing cold as your foot goes in, going, whoa, this is glacier water. Oh my God. You might have been, playing a little song in your head, right? Until your foot goes in the water and you're like, whoa, now I'm not thinking about a song. I'm not thinking about the fight I had with somebody. I'm not thinking about my bills. I'm thinking about this water. My whole perspective on the day has changed, And then when you take your foot out, the warmth of the sun, which was just a background detail, might have been an annoyance if you were hiking and getting overheated. Now for your foot, it feels wonderful because your foot's warming up because of the sun. So it's like everything about your inner world, is also transformed through the shock of the experience. And so, what Heraclitus is getting at is, old simple categories of things either are or they are not. It says those are inadequate to explain a world in which things are always transforming. And as Gene says, flow, like the water flowing, is just the smallest part of transformation. There's also you're growing and learning and aging, and new things are coming into your mind. You're becoming a new person moment by moment. So yeah, Heraclitus would say this is all legit. Paradox is legitimate. It's a normal part of dealing with the world.
Appreciate that.
Great question, Dawson. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I was so a bit curious about the thing where you're referencing pointing at the moon. That's something I recollect from sometime when I was learning to speak, sometime in between the ages of 2 and 3. So, perhaps shortly after turning 2. I remember my mother, I think, was trying to introduce me to some words, and like my dad was there and she was going, sort of going, motioning at my dad and saying, Dad, I think. I'm sitting there and thinking, well, does she mean him or some other object? Does she mean that object sitting on the bench or that object on a wall? So I was failing to privilege the human in the picture. But it was only later, a little bit later, that somehow one word came out of the ether, it's like it came into my head. It just like it was sitting in front of my face and just came in. That was the word that, which I'd heard a great deal of. And I realised that could refer to any object. So I pointed with my finger, I think, and, I wanted to know the names of all the objects in a room. So, I'd go that. And my mother, for quite a while, didn't know what I was going on about. She thought that I literally wanted the object. She was trying to bring the object to me. And I said, no, and, that. And it took her a while to figure out that I wanted to know the names of the various objects I nominated. But, before that, Dad. Oh, yeah, there's him. And there's that over there, and there's this other object. Which one are you? I couldn't figure out. It's like you're under a pressure. It's like you're in a school exam. You felt, if you got it wrong, you felt bad.
Yes.
But you just weren't sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I think I've mentioned before I'm starting to study Latin, and one of my favorite online Latin instructors says that a great exercise is exactly what you were doing as a kid, which is just sit in your chair and look around the room and ask yourself, do I know how to say that in Latin? What about that? What about that? And it forces you to connect the abstract learning of a language with your actual life and the experience that you're having. And until you do that, the language remains at arm's length. It's not really a part of your life. But as you begin to connect to all the things that make up your experience, then the language can enter your life and be a part of your everyday existence.
But your thing about pointing at the moon, so are you talking about the moon or the tip of your finger?
Exactly. Yes.
So
Yes.
it's almost as though you have to privilege something that says somehow you have to know that the moon is a priority.
That's right. That's right. Because if I hold my finger out to my cats and try to point at something, this is a thing cats really don't do. They will not follow the finger somewhere else because the finger is very interesting to them. The finger is almost always the point of privilege. They want to nuzzle the finger. Ooh, it's Papa's finger. But it turns out cat psychology, although you can't point to the moon, you can look at the moon. Cats are always interested in where the other cats are looking. And if you got 4 cats and 3 of them are staring in one direction, as soon as the 4th one notices, it turns and looks in that direction too. What are we looking at? And so the eyes are the finger pointing to the moon for a cat. And you cannot get the cat to think that the finger is the finger pointing to the moon. It just doesn't, that's not a cat thing. They're not interested. And so, we have similar problems like you're saying. It's with our relationship to language and concepts and so on. And when we work through philosophy, existentialist philosophy like Kenneth Smith's, it really forces us to confront the limitations of our language and our cognitive frameworks and so on as tools to try to follow the conversation. For Gene's benefit, in case you didn't notice, in the chat, David shared a link to a Google document, which I don't think I had before, and I'm saving it now. I'm very happy to have it, which is a spreadsheet that has links to YouTube for each and every one of the 142 sessions, plus the sessions before this. We actually were going for a year before we started Millennia and Microcosm. So it's possible to go back and look at selected sessions. Like if you normally come but you miss one, you can always go watch the YouTube video. And granted, it's not text, but I'm following up on that, Gene. I'm interested. We'll see what we can do about text. But at least it's a way to reconstruct. He also shared a link to he shared a single page, which is a reference to, we did do a session early on called The Philosophy of Kenneth Smith. And I don't remember how long it was, 2 hours or something, in which I made a slideshow presentation and I tried, I think it failed, but I tried to boil down some of the essentials of Kenneth Smith's philosophy into just one little 2 hour.
The meeting runs 4 hours total.
Oh, okay. I couldn't remember.
So normally a person might take about an hour, and then everyone blathers on for about 3 hours, not getting terribly far. This tends to bother me that really, I've been going through a few of these philosophy meetings, and people will go on at great length. And it's I feel counterproductive when people, they say they ask questions and they don't try and keep it a bit short, or it's a bit like Nietzsche's point about putting things in a nutshell. And a lot of people, I'm starting to feel like it's sort of like time is the essence, and we know there's a lot of stuff to understand, but people in the meetings will sort of just are on about, and it can become counterproductive.
Yes, it can. Geneva, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Okay, so I'm going to blame you and Phil for this because, every time I hear Hegel, I have I'm developing this unhealthy relationship with the term. But Phil made a comment. I'm kind of like Donald and Plato. It's like I've got to say something now. But something Phil said earlier, and maybe I'm taking this out of context, but I'm just wondering. He asked a question, something about if there was a choreographer of, I guess, human nature, maybe. And when I think of that, I don't know if that's what you said or not, Phil, but that's kind of the way I took it. And I'm kind of wondering, because of what Hegel says about the seed, the bloom, the trunk, the blah, blah, blah. And and Sharon might need to help me here, but having just had stem cell transplant, I was asking the doctor, well, how is it going to know what to do when it gets in there? Because there were cancerous cells in my blood cells. And so they give this massive dosage of chemotherapy to kill them all. And then from the stem cells that they had already taken out of me and frozen, they put them back in. And I said to him, but how's it going to know? How's it not going to recreate the cancerous stuff? And he said that there were little signals in the bone marrow that tell the blood cells what to make. I'm like, you've got to be joking. It's like, what? And he's like, yeah, it'll tell the blood what to make. And so to me, that sounds like there is some type of choreographer or architectural plan or something for not just trees and flowers and all of that things, all those things, but for us, for bodies and minds as well. And I think maybe part of the problem is not letting the architect do these things. We're always trying to figure it out, and we get into our heads, like I'm doing now, and try to figure these things out. And that may, because something else Phil said that Muhammad Ali was saying, well, yeah, he knew what to do and had the plan until somebody punches you in the face. Well, suddenly you've got to change whatever the hell it was you were doing to keep that from happening again. And so I guess it is sort of that transgressive learning, missing the mark, making adjustments, doing something else, finding a better way, not maybe necessarily the right way, but finding a better way. And it's just that continuous process. So I think that's what I'm getting more and more from Hegel and from these meetings. It sounds like it works.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Cancer and stem cell, it's a really interesting topic. My first true love, as a field of knowledge is biology. I was reading grown-up books on evolution before I entered first grade. And at that point, when I say reading, I mean, we got the Time Life series, The Emergence of Man, which went through, evolution as we understood it in the early 70s in enormous detail. I mean, you've seen these Time Life collections. It's, yay number of books, well illustrated, well organized. And I just fell in love with it. And so all my life, the metaphors that I use to understand things are biological metaphors: embryogenesis, evolution, all of, that's why the dialectic, Hegel's bud, blossom, and fruit just resonates for me. It's like, oh yeah, that's because there are so many things that are the normal, natural, essential parts of biology that makes it possible for us to exist at all, that are almost inexpressible in terms of physics or chemistry. I mean, you can tangentially, leash onto them and say, well, it's all carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. It's like, well, sure, but if you dump a bunch of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen in a chamber, you don't get Geneva. So there's more to it that's going on than just the raw ingredients. And chemistry and physics are good at the raw ingredients and basic stuff, but they really can't explain why does life, instead of winding down into entropy, why does it wind up into organization? The embryogenesis is astonishing, right? How does the one cell become that is only one kind of cell, right? It's not like there's no specialization. It's as generic as a cell can get. So how does it become all of these different tissues in our body, and how do they know I should be a bone and not a muscle? Well, I should be a neuron. How do they know that? And there is a lot of research into this area, but I just say two of the things just briefly, given what you introduced as a thing. One of them is, when we teach biology in school, we overemphasize the brain. The brain's in charge of everything. The brain makes all the decisions. The truth is, the brain makes hardly any decisions. The body mostly does. You begin becoming an embryo before you even have a brain. I mean, before the first neuron is even specialized out of the general cells that are splitting, they're already knowing how to divide and differentiate. They figured out without a neuron, let alone without a brain. And part of what's happening is hormones. Hormones are incredibly important. Hormones have ranges. Some hormones are wide ranging and affect all of your cells. and other hormones are very short range and only affect the cells nearby. And that means that through the release of hormones, you can have locations, right? You could have hormones happening on the left, but not on the right. And now the left might start developing into a head, and the right might start developing legs because of the presence or absence of hormones. The hormones are playing the DNA like the way a pianist plays a piano. It's like, yeah, all the notes are on the piano, but which order are they playing in? You know, which proteins are being generated? What's the focus? That's being controlled by these hormones that are playing the DNA. And so, you know, as a woman, you've got centers of hormones that are really strong in different places. I mean, human reproduction would be impossible without that. And it means that this whole idea that there are places in your body where, you know, some hormones are at incredible intensity levels, and then just, you know, a few inches away, they're undetectable. They're really localized. So in embryogenesis, the idea is that, you know, you start by growing like an amorphous group of cells, but gradually you start to develop locations that say, oh, we're going to stop multiplying cells. And another place says, well, we're going to multiply lots of cells. And so you get changes in density. And then you get things like budding, where one spot on the sphere says, okay, we're going to make a lot of cells and we're going to grow that way. And, you know, as we move out, we're going to keep the hormone center is going to move out with us. And eventually we have a hand at the end of an arm. This thing budded out and kept saying, no, go grow, 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 grow. Okay, stop. Now it's time to split. And this is all being done through this dance back and forth between the genes and the hormones. So that's the first thing. And so when they put stem cells in there, where they put the stem cells are going to be in certain hormone baths. And that's going to tell which part of their DNA is going to turn on and which part's going to stay off. And that controls what they diversify into. It's really interesting. And this is a part of human biology we're pretty bad at right now. I mean, we don't have a catalog of all the different hormones and, you know, where are they all acting, and, you know, what are, especially during embryogenesis, what are the stages at which a hormone is really important, and then after that stage it turns off and doesn't, you know, isn't used anymore. We're just, I mean, we're at the baby steps level of trying to sequence out all of that happens. The other thing that happens in the body that's really interesting is channels. So and I'm not doing any woo here. I'm going to stick strictly to science. Electricity is an important part of the body. There are, you know, why does a neuron grow the length of your arm? Why doesn't it just sit there as a blob? How does it know to go, you know, a length? And part of what happens in the body is that as the blood vessels spread out, they leave lines right alongside them that have higher or lower electrical conductivity. And you can get a home kit, a probe, a little electrical probe with a meter, and stick it on different parts of your body, on different parts of your skin. And in some places, there'll be a lot of resistance. And other places, there'll be a lot of conductivity, where the electricity will really conduct. And if you map it out, they follow the veins and the arteries, the lines along your body. Even before you get a neuron in there, you've got this sort of electrical map that's growing as the tissues grow. And part of what happens when you heal, if you get a cut, part of what happens is that flow of very low level flow of electricity is interrupted. And that's what tells the cells at that location that they've got a problem, and they put out new hormones that say we have to go back to our design. We have to fix ourselves and try to reconstruct our original design. Things aren't, this cut's not supposed to be here. That's not a feature, that's a bug. You know, and it tells because of the interruption in the channel. And so it keeps healing until the channel's reestablished. And then when the channel's reestablished, then it's not stimulating the hormones anymore. So the hormones go away, and so the healing stops, and voila, you've got a scar, and it's repaired the tissue. So there's these really low level patterns that your body is repeating over and over in different parts that are helping it to decide what to do with its undifferentiated cells. And how do they know what they should turn into? What should they differentiate into? Yeah. It's this combination. There's sort of a map of your body that's being generated through chemistry and through electricity, and the cell finds itself someplace inside that map, and that location is also a place where it's going to be bombarded with certain hormones but not others, and where it's going to get certain charges and not others, and the combination is what tells it what song to play. Okay, I guess I'm a neuron.
So there is a sort of choreographer, I guess, or something is in charge of this, right? I mean,
It's like an
it
emergent choreography rather than having a
oh,
choreographer. It's a
okay,
network effect. It's like
okay.
you've seen flash mobs, videos of flash
Mhm.
mobs. They say,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
let's all dance. Let's
Uh,
all. And
oh,
usually it's
right.
somebody planning, but it doesn't have to be. The really interesting ones are where just somebody is just bored and decides to start singing something. And it's some song, and the people nearby, some of them know it. And so they start singing too. And the next thing you know, you got 100 people in, Times Square, and they're all singing this song, not because anybody planned it, but because
Mhm.
something inside themselves responded to their habitat and said, yes, I want to be a part of this. I want to help this thing grow. I want to build this center of order. So that's kind of what happens with these hormone fields. You get more of the cells near each other being influenced by each other. So they put out more hormones. And now the hormone field is stronger. And so other cells that weren't involved, they hear the hormones and they're like, oh, maybe I want to sing that song too, because that smells great. Let's do some of that. Um, it's one of the
Oh,
reasons I like to study slime molds. Slime molds are amoebas. They're not actually slimes. They're
oh,
amoebas that are social. And so they spend a certain amount of their life ignoring each other and just running around hunting bacteria. But under certain kinds of duress, like if they're running out of bacteria and they're starting to get hungry, they'll emit a chemical, a CAMP, which is related to what we use for energy construction, ATP in our cells. CAMP is monophosphate instead of triphosphate. They'll release CAMP, which is their way of saying, things don't seem good here anymore. Do they seem good to you? And if more and more of them are releasing CAMP, you get a big CAMP field, and the CAMP field changes the behavior of the amoebas. They all say, maybe instead of being solo, maybe we should work together. So they all move towards the concentration of the greatest CAMP. And the closer they get to each other, the more concentrated the CAMP gets, until finally they assemble themselves into something that looks like a slug. And this is what they do because of the hormone, and they release the hormone because they were hungry, and more of them were hungry, and that was the trigger. There was no choreographer, nobody
right.
decided in
Okay.
advance. It's an emergent effect where they hear each other and they respond to each other, and it causes new behavior to emerge seemingly from nowhere. But it's so effective that this single-celled organism suddenly becomes a multi-celled organism. They all group together, they all specialize. Some of them decide to be the ones looking for where do we go. Some of the ones are the ones pushing them along. I mean, they like temporarily specialize and take on roles. And then they call it a Grex, but it looks like a slug. It goes for a journey. It says, this place sucks. There's no bacteria here. We got to go find some bacteria. And so the Grex just heads off. And then eventually, when it finds more bacteria, then the amoebas stop releasing CAMP because they're not hungry anymore. And because there's not CAMP, they're not feeling that desire to come together into a slug anymore. So they break back up into separate amoebas and spread out into their habitat. They go hunting bacteria. And this whole exchange happened without any choreographer.
Yeah.
It emerges, right? It's a field effect. It's a network effect. It's very interesting. And a lot of nature is organized this way. A lot of it. The balance between wolves and rabbits, the population balance. There's nobody overseeing that. There are natural boom and bust cycles that happen as a result of, if you overpredate on your bunnies, then there aren't enough bunnies, and so your wolves, some of your wolves die out until the number of wolves drops down to the level that's suitable
Oh,
for
right.
bunnies,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
this kind of balancing is happening dynamically because of these feedback loops. The feedback loops themselves are a kind of polyntropy, right? Where, feast and famine are harnessed together in the case of the wolves and the bunnies in order to keep their populations tethered together. And that's the same thing that happens in the control of your own blood sugar, and I've talked before about, insulin and glucagon. It's the same thing that happens with blood pressure. It's all of this stuff. So anyway, that's part of what they mean when they say they could just put the stem cells in there and the stem cells will smell the environment of where they are in your body, and that'll tell them what they need to do. It's interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe I want to go to medical school now.
It's cool, right? It's cool stuff.
Yeah, it's really cool stuff.
Phil, come
It's
on.
your fault, Phil.
Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, That was wonderful. For the two talk, I was gonna slightly correct, Geneva. What I mean, the relationship between distributed harmony and choreography, which is a much more man-made thing. And the way you put it, it really extends existentialism to a different level. In other words, that goes beyond human beings to nature itself, because human beings have created a second ecological cycle, which depends on the relationship between individuals and groups and the relationship between one and the many. And I think the distributed relationship is probably more like the emergent property of structures rather than a kind of a kind of metaphysical relationship which is built on structure relationship of the mind. It's a little different, although I love classical music, it's a little different between classical music and jazz. I mean, jazz is much more impromptu and much more distributed. I mean, everybody kind of has a say, particularly in a small ensemble, not in a big band. So that's important to know. I was going to say before you went on this, I guess, different relationship between existentialism and the way I normally understand it is like about, because I was going to say, what actually is the difference? Because it seems like existentialism, is the way I normally see it, is another kind of Copernican turn. In other words, man is at the center of everything. Like the Copernican turn is we finally figure out how the universe works, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and so forth, Newton, and so forth. And so, therefore, we have the understanding of the structure of the universe. And so, in some sense, we create the structure of the universe rather than the fact that the universe exists, and we learn from it in a sense. And so, that's the traditional Copernican turn. But existential Copernican turn happened much earlier. Like man is at the center, don't you see? The earth is the center of the world. And was created for us, man to exist in. And so, in some sense, it's a kind of existential Copernican turn, in some sense. So, either case, it seems like, yeah, but where really is being, because being is wrapped up in the Copernican turn of its own, then that is not being itself as well. So the relationship between knowing and being, both ends are controlled by mankind. We have man at the center of the universe for both. No wonder we disregard nature. Like, oh, that's just a resource we use, exploit, whether it's minerals or forest, we just chop it down, make it into, firewood or coal or build houses with it. And so there's not enough respect for the fact that there's the true otherness, which is nature, or you could even say the cosmos itself. So I was going to level that accusation, like, what the hell is the difference, whether you're existentialist or, I guess a structuralist, because they're both at both ends. We control both ends. So I now understand that it's a different kind of existentialism that unfolds into nature
Yeah.
in a much broader way, and we therefore at least have the beginning of the respect for the otherness of being beyond ourselves. So that's an important. Thank you for that conversation, because that really straightens up that man is not necessarily the center of the universe. Of course, it's important for us because we live as mankind and we have to organize our structure in a at least a semi-distributed relationship so that it's in balance with ourselves. So our ecosystem is in harmony rather than tearing ourselves apart. That's it, Phil. Thanks.
Thank you, Phil. Gene, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. And yeah, it's it's normal in the course of these lines that we have of people waiting that the subject moves on, but it's okay to pull it back. It's fine to pull it back to where it was. Oh, you're muted again. You accidentally hit the mute button twice.
I'm in a lot of philosophy forums in the last few months, day and night, and they don't usually use this model of muting people. They usually use the hand in conjunction with people responding to, to something someone says. And they use both together so that there's more of a free, if you're interested in flow. And it also leads to more effective harnessing. So I wasn't used to this kind of format. So that's why I said that, not that I would feel to go back to previous topic, but it actually interferes with the comprehensive, for me, maybe not for anyone else, but for all these other philosophers, it also interferes with the comprehensive processing of data that's set up here. So it's something to experiment with, I think, possibly. So what I wanted to say, I have to go and catch an Uber to the hospital soon. But what I wanted to say is that I have a different understanding of language and what humanity is searching for and how to find it than the way you expressed it, Rick. I'm very interested in the subject of, that's my special subject of study, is different modes or styles of communication. And how it affects people socially. Like one would be literalism, another, because all of these modes we use, but it's when one takes over that it becomes not real communication. So that one is literalism, another is like Zen Buddhism, everything's all one, or the universe. And the third one, which is comprehensive, is more the middle way school Buddhism would be an example of that. But other people have never heard of that school. Many people have the comprehensive data processing. Anyway, what I wanted to say about language is there's some things that cannot be expressed by language. And if you guys are expressionists, which I'm just starting to understand what that means, I'm sure you grok that and understand that. But the thing is, this is my understanding, which I did not read in a book, but I just pondered a long time, is that humanity has actually entered, it's not even entering it, it's already entered a brand new paradigm, which is people are trying to discover a new way to use language. And the previous paradigm before this, which went on for several decades, many decades, was realizing that everything was interdependent. And humanity's already been through that paradigm for several decades, and most people have a grasp of that. Just any person walking down the street has a kind of a grasp of that. So, and then the previous paradigm, is all I know about, was the Newtonian paradigm, where people perceived everything as existing independently outside of themselves. But the thing is, in terms of discovering a new way to use language, it can actually affect, if we do discover that, there's a way to have it affect people who aren't even present. It can affect trends and tendencies in broader society via something called the Bell's theorem. It's not really a theorem, it's kind of proven. And they call it the butterfly effect, where we can influence things non-locally if a certain affect is created, which in my humble opinion, we're not just here, but anywhere I've been, we're not creating yet. So I think it's an important question I don't have any kind of answer, but I've been on the subject of this new paradigm for almost a year. But I think it's really important to try to discover that, rather than just put my own conclusions about the way I already use language onto the new way and try to say, oh, that's the new way, because it's not. And there's some things that can only be acted out. They can't be named. Okay, confirm my speaking language. It just says, okay, English. Okay, well, anyway, thank you. I'm going to be off camera. I guess I'm going to try to get ready for the meeting. If I don't, I may just leave the computer on until I leave. So,
Sure.
hey, thank you guys. I'll still be listening.
Thank you, Jean. Great comments.
Thanks.
Yeah, communication is a challenge. And when we look at how strongly related is our ability to think about our subject and our ability to talk about a subject, we really start to see how, even though sort of the official position that we're all taught in school is that in our minds we're free and our minds wander the universe and can think about anything they want to. The truth is a lot more complicated than that. There's really some kind of some structural relationships between what have we been exposed to before and what are we able to think about now. So it doesn't have to be real things, but if we've read Lord of the Rings, we've been exposed to dragons, then our mind can wander in the world of dragons. But if we've literally never in our lives encountered a story or a picture or anything to imply dragons, it might not be possible to think about them. There's certainly more restrictive, and this becomes a lot clearer when we look at things that are not as tangible, but perhaps more important, like these issues of synapthy and emergent order and polyntropy and the dialectic and so on. People who haven't been exposed to these ideas might still struggle at the level of, does something exist or does it not exist, and think that they have to force things into one side or the other because that's the way that they've always done it before. The first time they encounter someone who says, no, it can both exist and not exist at the same time. That's possible. That happens in the world all the time. For them, it's a revelation and they have to process it and absorb it and find language to talk about it. So we're really, in these sessions, we may be, 142 weeks in on Millennia Microcosm, plus all the ones we did before this. But in some sense, we're still at the beginning when it comes to trying to identify what are all of the really important concepts we need words for to help us express some of these, intricate relationships. I put a link in the chat to Christopher Alexander's 4-volume series, The Nature of Order, an essay on the art of building and the nature of the universe. His first volume is called The Phenomenon of Life. And in it, he tries to characterize life, not in the way that biologists do, but in a way that's more generalizable than that. That's not as stuck in a narrow little hole. And so he defines it geometrically, and so that he can express how a river might be alive, or a river delta might be alive, or the ripples across sand dunes in a desert might be alive. Think the solar system in a sense is alive, and he doesn't mean in a Gaia-like sense per se, but in the sense that it holds itself together and it repeats patterns over time. So the Phenomenon of Life is a very interesting book from that perspective. And in the second volume, The Process of Creating Life, which is in some ways the more interesting book, but you have to read the first one to prepare yourself for it. He talks about field effects. I'm back to Geneva again for a second. He talks about field effects and how our brains are able to recognize not only things that are there, but things that aren't there yet, but could be, or things that maybe they are there, but we haven't detected them yet. So we go looking for them to see if maybe they're there. There's this way in which the human brain not only looks for the patterns that exist, but it superimposes over that other potential patterns that would make sense or feel harmonizing to us. And that process is critically important to all creative works, including architecture. And he argues it's also important to embryogenesis, healing in the human body, and things like that. And he cites some really interesting examples in that volume 2 of that series. One of them is he takes a blank piece of paper and says, right now, there are fields on this piece of paper that your brain detects. It detects the edges, it detects the corners, and it detects the center away from the edges and the corners. And in your brain, those areas already exist before you even put your pencil to the paper. And if you were thinking about drawing something, but somebody else steps in front of you and they take a red pen and they put a red dot just in from a corner a little ways, it changes. The whole field of potential things that could be drawn changes. Your brain responds immediately, whether you're conscious or not. It responds immediately to the asymmetry that's been created. Because up until now, it was symmetrical. But now there's this red dot up in from one of the corners and not in any of the others. And it creates a new center. And he shows how, with dotted lines, he kind of shows how your brain sketches in. You could do diagonals from all the corners to that red dot. You could do a circle around that red dot. You could do lines parallel to the edges of the paper with that red dot. So you get one big rectangle and two medium-sized rectangles and one tiny square in the corner. There's all kinds of things, and your brain actually does those things. whether you know it or not. And part of what you can see coming out of that is if you're then going to do if you're going to then do an architectural design or an artistic design, if you take into account those fields and potential lines that your brain already has superimposed over the page, it's satisfying. It feels right. It feels like, yes, this is a good step. This is something you should do. And so in volume 2, he develops this concept that the world is not organized the way that we traditionally teach it in, you know, geometry classes and geography and all the other kinds of ways that we try to teach how the world is organized. From our brain's perspective, the world is organized around centers, and strong centers and weak centers and dysfunctional centers that want to be healed or improved. He talks about the process of architecture or art or healing as a process in which you find a strong center that could use some help. And then you look at the potential on the page, if you will, and you see where could the next thing go that could help heal the center and make it better. And he shows examples where you ignore that and don't do it, and they're not satisfying. And he shows examples where you pay attention to that and you do it, and they're just subjectively, they feel right, they feel good. And in these volumes, he's trying to develop language to talk about this thing in us is very powerful, this impulse that underlies all these creative works. And yet we have hardly any words to talk about it. We don't have a name for it. We barely acknowledge it's even happening. We don't teach it clearly in school or elsewhere. He says architecture schools teach nothing of this. He's an architect, the guy who wrote this. He says it's part of what's wrong with modern architecture. But traditional architecture works exactly this way. You know, you don't have an infinite number of resources in the Middle Ages. So if there's something wrong with your cathedral, you focus on the thing that's wrong and you figure out, how can I strengthen that? And the next thing you know, you've got flying buttresses. So the walls won't fall down. And suddenly you have a look. You know, it's like, ooh, flying buttresses. Let's do that. This is, you know, let's keep this going. This becomes a pattern that gets replicated, and it's satisfying. It feels it. We may have never seen it before in the world, but the first time we see one, it captures us because it's obeying these rules of centers and unfolding and so forth. So language, right? Language and thought and the real world have these very complex relationships that have structure to them, but that we don't have a lot of words for. And so it's part of why I'm really interested in this topic of the relationship between language and thought. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I'm going to undergo time reversal here to Geneva's comment. You know, Kenneth is, you know, when he says, you know, philosophy is either existentialist or escapist, you know, I think that's critical, comes up every week, and it has, you know. It's one of his critical, it leads to some things I think that are quite distinct about what Kenneth is saying. Traditionally or historically or whatever, there's sort of this conflict between existentialism and what we might call essentialism or whatever, that they're essences and who has priority, and that's not where Kenneth is going. It's our philosophy always starts with our own experience. It's existential, and it must be. But what's unique, I think, or somewhat unique, is that Kenneth then says, well, all the things we experience are organisms guided by arche. Ourselves, whether we say there's arche that guide biology, but even in our more individualized selves, there's our character and our demon, which we've talked about. And so some people might have said, well, gosh, he started off existential and he just fell right back into essentialism or something. But not all existentialism does this, because there are varieties of existentialism that reject all. It's a matter of will. When they say philosophy is existentialist, they say man is the center of all things and he creates all things through his own will, which Kenneth also doesn't rejects, I think. So there's this, yeah, it's existentialist in the sense that we begin with our experience of the world. That's not the only thing. I think last week when I said Geneva had made a truly philosophical observation in that we learn from our mistakes. I hope that's true. I wasn't meaning that that's the only way we can learn. We can learn from our predecessors. You know, we can learn from experiences that aren't our mistakes. We can learn from the way we're treated, the way we treat others, behaviors, all of these things, existential. But that's our opening. Living is our, I guess, yeah. Living's our introduction to philosophy. Rocks don't study philosophy or whatever. And I think, and not all philosophies would point us towards looking for the arche that govern the cosmos, all organisms, ourselves. And that's sort of what's, I think, is a unique defining characteristic of Kenneth's existentialism, is that he captures. It's more like, what do you say, the bud, the flower, the fruit. You know, he's looked at something that's been traditionally a binary choice. You're existentialist or you're idealist. Idealism is another word for essentialism sometimes. You know, but that's not true. We can have essences that we must discover through our own existence, and there's no other way to discover them. Enough. Don't let me sleep, Geneva. Phil woke me up last week with his Plato stuff.
Thank you, Donald. All right, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, actually, can I have a moment? I'll speak in maybe after Phil.
Sure.
If that's okay, that'd be great.
Yeah, go ahead. So Phil, come off mute. Oops, sorry. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. I just muted you again.
Yeah, in response to Donald, by the way, it's a big positive response, and to Geneva, both positive. But one has to learn from one's own mistake to at least some sort of understanding of one's own mistake, which means that one has to be introspective and contemplate one's mistake, you know. To just simply say, oh, I made a mistake, it's not a big deal. That's not good enough. And I'll make a confession to you how I learned a mistake. I came to this country when I was 10, and we had to go to school, and I, by chance, figure out how to go to school. I knew what to go to school at. But I was surprised, and it's a funny association when I discover these sort of what you call machines where you put money into for parking your car. I didn't realize it was parking your car. I said, God damn, this society is full of gamblers. This the slot machines all over the place, right? And I used to go down and try to put a penny in this and a penny in that. I couldn't even figure out if I win, where's the money going to come out of? But I think, well, it must be something there. Okay. So after doing that for a while, I ran out of pennies and I decided to exploit my sister. I said, we go to good school. I happen to know how to get to school. I'm going to charge you 2 penny to take you to school. Now, 2 pennies back then was 1956, would still be substantial money for a kid, particularly when we're poor, just immigrants. She refused. I said, okay, go ahead, refuse. That's your choice. So I left without her. And when I came back, she wasn't there. And later on, a police officer returned her and she was crying. And I said, oh my gosh, I shouldn't have done that. That's how I begin to understand a very important thing, which I sort of contemplated and knew about, is that this is not worth, exploitation is not worth it. At least not worth it to somebody you care for and love. All right. So that's how I learned about that in a very prominent way. Of course, I already knew that, but not to the degree that it actually I could be exploitive as anybody else. And you got to know what the limits are. So that was a mistake. I made that, but I had to internalize it and comprehend that I actually made a mistake. I didn't say, well, it was her damn choice. Like, so what? She deserved being put in a quandary. So, yeah, when you make a mistake, you have to internalize it, understand it, build it into your inner structure of understanding. And so I have been much more careful. Not that I wouldn't say that I would never exploit anybody, but I got to be very careful when I exploit anybody at all whatsoever. Because fairness is a very, very important concept to living with others. That's it, Phil. Thank you, Donald. Thank you, Geneva.
Thank you, Phil. Ari, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind, if this is a good time.
Yeah, thanks. It was perfect. I actually just dropped off my son at preschool, so I got a moment there. Yeah, I love how we're still on this idea of the limits of language or what language is, and it really gets me to a book I read recently called Incompleteness by Rebecca Goldstein. I'm sure we can put that in the chat if we want. And it has to do with incompleteness is the famous Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Really, just one of them, but he has two of them essentially, and they're based on his motivation is that he was a Platonist, really believing that things have essential forms as an essentialist, and that our access to these essential forms is really limited, and specifically the tool we use, language, has really specific limits. And this is in the context of the book is really nice. It talks about I think probably the most famous philosopher to talk about this is Wittgenstein. And I think of his quote, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent. One must be silent," in the Tractatus. And a lot of times, Wittgenstein is this quote is misunderstood, and especially this is earlier Wittgenstein versus late Wittgenstein. Early Wittgenstein thought language, the only thing you could do in language to be meaningful was be purely descriptive. And later on, he realizes it's also very generative and not just descriptive. Like what Nietzsche says, the most powerful thing language can do is actually to make a promise. Or Hannah Arendt will say the most powerful thing in language is to make forgiveness. right? So these generate realities as opposed to just describe reality. But in this, it's like in the thing of, I don't know, covering maybe too many ideas, but I think most of us are familiar with logical positivism, that the only things that exist in like phenomenology, this idea, the only things that exist are phenomena that you can observe, and language just observes these things, as opposed to what modern neuroscience and also Gödel's incompleteness theorem really says, is that no. Language actually creates the observation. It creates the theory of mind by which you will frame your observation and actually brings the observation to be perceived. That you cannot perceive things that you can't describe. But the idea here is that we can't speak about things, we should remain silent. I really like to summarize this point for the way that Rebecca Goldstein really points out here, is that oftentimes this is said as that Wittgenstein is seen as a logical positivist, and this is just his thing, that everything is descriptive and that everything else is meaningless. And really what she was pointing out in a more nuanced, really complex way, that he was actually really upset that he was put into logical positivism as a phenomenologist. And he was just pointing out that language can only do this, but reality is so much more than this. And even still, when his later self changes his opinions on what language does, he still never changes the idea that language really has limits. And then the beautiful idea from a mathematical point of view is seeing all the possible permutations of that language can be put together, that Gödel puts together this whole amazing system of what language does, as both being referencing external things, but also being self-referential, creates this strange paradox that brings itself into being. It creates a palentropos. I don't know if anybody's familiar with his theory, but essentially, to really give the short, overly reduced version to validate. She's not here anymore. Validate Jean's criticism of some of the things I say, is that I really reduce them beyond what their really essential, real complex nature is. So it sounds very just flow, which was not supposed to be just flow. It's supposed to be so much more than just flow. Is reduced to this idea that he creates this language, currently called Gödel's numbers, that represent types of propositions you can make with language, and that each one of these represents an actual function or actual arithmetic that you do, like numbers being added to each other, but they also represent something more abstract that's more semantic. So he creates like almost a nice language within a language, where you have both lexicon, which is this actually describing something in reality, but then semantic, that's just about the meaning. And he proves this letter G, which is, again, it's interesting, it's his name, his letter. But it's this weird idea that G equals negative G. And it's like, or that by G existing, it proves that G can't exist, is the mathematical formula. That it gets a self-contradiction. And that only by being able to step outside of this purely internal self-referencing system, you can see the truth that, yes, both G exists, but you can't prove it, right? And so this is this weird idea that when you're in self-reference mode, which is this purely descriptive language, you get stuck. And it's just, there are a lot of truths that exist outside of what can be described in language. And the whole point of this was to get to this, to try to validate that the things that you observe can't be everything. And especially using language to describe everything is also just foolish nonsense. And so it's really like a nice idea that I'm sure we'll explore also, which we're kind of doing here, but the nature of language and the nature of description is really quite nuanced and complex. And it's not just descriptive, as Wittgenstein wanted to do in the Tractatus. He's just like everything, and everything else is meaningless. That later on he really gets to this idea that no, language actually brings things together. It's almost like there's a dialectic within language for language. Like language has its opposites, and it brings itself into being, and again in a strange self-contradictory way. It's almost like, I like what I believe personally is language is itself a living thing. It mimics life itself, that does this exact same thing, that only by having something opposing it does it have something to push against, and therefore it can be into being. And so it's like this really strange idea that's not so much paradox, but self-contradiction. And again, to the idea of what these principles of what language and math has, is that there's a whole nother topic, but free will is essentially this idea, at least I break it down, to this idea to make decisions, make choices. You can choose this or that. And in order to do that in math, they call it decidability. And Turing, Alan Turing was the famous guy who changed the incompleteness to this decidability, which all you guys who love computers and code, I'm sure will eat this up, is he was famous for saying that many things are not decidable based on this idea that they were incomplete. And there's a hierarchy within math that in order to be decidable, in order to make a choice, you have to have consistency. Because otherwise it's like this is both A and B. Well, then I don't know. I can't do A or B. So they have to be separate and therefore they have to be consistent. And when you get to this incompleteness theorem, the second theorem that he had was that things can't be proved consistent, because if you do that, then it contradicts the earlier proof that things are incomplete. And essentially you get this hierarchy that decidability comes from consistency and consistency comes from completeness. And if you believe that there's incompleteness and that the brain is just doing some sort of language-based thing or some sort of zeros and ones based thing, there's no such thing as consistency, and then there's no such thing as decidability, and now you don't have free will, and you get to this very postmodern, like reduced idea that we're not actually doing anything, we're just machines that believe we're doing things, but the free will is just an illusion. And I don't want to go too long, but this idea that it seems obvious to all other eras or aspects. I don't even call it as just, just the ancient era and the Christian era, or the medieval era and the modern era. But even if you break down even these epics into their smaller eras or whatever you want to like the time frames, everyone else seems to agree we have a certain amount of choice and free will. All the religions, all the philosophies, there is free will. Otherwise, we're just robots. And it's only in our modern time, very recently, that we seem to get to this idea that we don't have any free will at all.
Right.
And so to me, I find this, again, the strange contradiction. And again, to me, I guess to bring it all together with a soft landing, is it all is based on our maybe misunderstanding of language itself, that we think it's just descriptive or it's just zeros and ones. But I think it's like a living thing that has a self-contradictory nature that brings itself into being. And at the same time, it has limits, but it's always so pushing those limits through creating. And it's almost like what Phil was just saying. Language doesn't create anything, but it recreates everything. And so it's like, in a certain way, that's very creative. It's creating something new, but at the same time, it's only creating that which was already existing. But then together, the creation and the recreation makes something new. That's not the recreation or just the creation. It's something beyond. And again, you have this almost like infinite regress where you seem to get stuck.
Yes.
So thanks for listening to my rambles. That was good. Okay.
It's a good ramble, and what it really emphasizes, and we've talked before about the halting problem in computer science and how it's for many up and coming programmers who are studying computer science, it's very depressing day when their professor introduces them to the halting problem and demonstrates that not only can't you write software that you can prove is correct, you can't even write software you can prove stops ever. You can't prove it doesn't go into an infinite loop. If you can't prove that, you certainly can't prove any of the more nuanced errors that could happen. Like, if I write a subroutine that's supposed to admit a patient to a hospital, well, I can't even prove that the thing ever stops. So I certainly can't prove that it successfully admitted the patient to the hospital, which is the reason the subroutine exists. And it's like, these are fundamental levels to be a failure. You just have to do your best, make the best software you can, and cross your fingers. And you're sort of stuck after a certain point. We're not used to, we're raised on this ideology of the power of the human mind, the infinite godlike power of the human mind. We're virtually imagining ourselves to be the I am, the God of Genesis, creating all the cosmos through our will and our intention. And this is a way that moderns often fantasize about themselves when they're not paying attention. And so this is why it's such a shot of ice water in the face when people who were raised with that understanding of the human brain discover that you can't even prove that your subroutine will ever stop, let alone that it does the right thing. It's weird to be so profoundly limited on such important basic things. And so what Ari's been talking about is how what Gödel has put together is a series of constructions that allow us to see not only can't we do this big, fantastic, complicated thing, we also can't do this much simpler thing. That the complicated thing, we can prove the complicated thing depends on the simpler thing. If we can't do the simple thing, we can't do the complicated thing. And then he shows there's an even more fundamental level below that, and we can't even do that. So, you fail at that level, you're going to fail at all the levels that follow. These are the sorts of things that people who read the Murphy's Law book or books chuckle about and say, yeah, that's what it is when humans try to do difficult, complex things. But it's the sort of thing that many people really are not ready to accept. They don't want it to be true. We want democracy to magically solve all our problems. We want the free market to magically solve all our problems. We want human reason to magically solve all our problems. We do not want to hear that these things are flawed human constructions, and some of the flaws they have are outstandingly egregious, and that our ability to fix things, to fix the errors in these things, are also flawed. I see this with revolutionaries, not people who actually do revolutions, but people who fantasize about revolutions, people who are fed up with the world and are like, well, when the revolution comes, we'll fix all that. And I'm like, well, did we fix all that with the previous revolution? What about the one before that? There have been a lot of revolutions. Did they fix everything? Or is that really how a revolution works? There is this level at which an enormous amount of what passes for rationality, and I'm anticipating Stephen here. An enormous amount of what passes for rationality turns out to be wishful thinking. It's founded on desiderata, as Kenneth says, things that we wish were so, and therefore we construct a whole escapist framework of logic to rationalize that it must be so, and then we try to make our plans assuming that our proof is binding on reality, and then of course our 777 drops out of the sky contrary to all of our plans, and we pull our hair out going, no, you have to obey reality. We told you what you're allowed to do. We proved it on a piece of paper. You have to do that thing. And then reality thumbs its nose at us and says, no, that's your proof, not my proof. All of these things are hard for us. And it's enormous amounts of the challenges that we have in human history come down to this discrepancy, this delta between what Kenneth Smith calls reality and what he calls actuality. And Joe made a comment in the chat I'm going to run with for a second here, where he says, how language creates our reality. Kenneth Smith defines reality as the reality that we mentally live in and imagine the world to be, not the way it actually is. And so an individual can have a reality, a culture can have a reality, an epoch can have a reality. And then actuality is how nature actually works, independent of what we think it does. And that delta between reality and actuality is where most of our catastrophes happen in history. It's like, Hitler had a tidy little theory about how he was going to make things go great for Germany. And if you stay within the framework that he laid out, it's all rational and logical. It all makes sense. It doesn't require hatred. It may be feeding off of bigotry, but it doesn't require it. It's a rational construct. It's just that rational constructs are orthogonal to reality. They may or may not align with it. And in his case, and many others, it did not align with reality. And thus the catastrophe and the Holocaust and all the terrible things that happen. This idea that just because we think something doesn't make reality bound by that thought. I mean, the world history would be fundamentally different if everybody accepted that there was a difference between the reality we imagine and the actuality we live in. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So again, bring up that points about existentialism versus escapism. This is a quite very interesting one, and then it seems to bring up a lot of what Kierkegaard was on about. He was critical of the Danes. He thought they had become the masters of living in their comfort zone. That, terribly sort of bourgeois sort of culture is all about avoiding intense emotions. And of course, today we sort of see it's in this whole sort of recent trend, of safe zones in the university. It's a comfort zone. We'll create a little room for you with comforting, fluffy toys. this is sort of overtaking the world presently. So you got now he saw it in the Danes in the early 19th century. He was offered a comfortable existence, you know, marry what's her name, and we'll find you a nice little parsonage in the woods where you can live out the rest of your life in, you know, the comfort zone, only with the weekly trial of giving a sermon and listening to the nonsense of the locals. And you can have a nice, pleasant little existence. And, you know, Kierkegaard, you know, threw that out the door. So it's this sort of tendency of bourgeois escapism. I remember Rudolf Steiner saying it's part of the polarity that this bourgeois tendency is really a type of Philisteinism. It's the desire to avoid the real questions, you know, and the book burning, you know. Oh, you know, all the stuff in this book's, it's doing my head in. Let's just burn all the books. It's easier, you know. In Fahrenheit 451, I remember the movie. He gets on a monorail and goes for a trip, and everybody's just in their own little comfort zone. You know, they want to avoid reality. Of course, Kierkegaard makes that point about the scales of society, that most people would rather meditate upon their belly button, live in their comfort zone, and pass the buck on real issues to somebody else. When it comes to the question of the larger responsibilities, they would rather pass the responsibility on to somebody else. And ultimately, when we're talking about the aristos, how a society gets its direction, well, no, I don't want to give myself a sense of direction. I'd rather pass it back on and let somebody else give me the direction, and that's a load off my mind, and I can spend all my time with my belly button, having a good time. There's a certain passivity in this attitude. It's something I was trying to warn somebody about, that don't let the big worlds, don't treat the big world as a god that you must rise up to. It's just full of human beings. They're just like you. You know, they have imperfections. They're all going to trip over the tree branch somewhere, you know, over the tree root. They're not that much better than you. You know, I was trying to point this out to somebody, that you're building up the external world and allowing it to overpower you in your imagination. And you need to reflect that, look, you're not so bad yourself. You have a real place in the world. You might have to contend with other people, but you have your own being and your own sense of value. But a lot of people today seem to have adopted the course of passivity. This is a nice little space. I just want to do my job, go home at 5 o'clock and watch my favourite TV drama, you know, be in the naval space. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it's interesting, and it's you know, Kenneth would say it's not a coincidence. It's cultivated that way. We're cultivating people to be passive and infantilized, and we're doing it because it's easier for the active people to get their way if they can convince most people to just go with the flow. You know, how many people look at yin and yang symbols and think that means go with the flow? You know, just go with the flow. And of course, the problem is that implies all changes are good. And anybody who spent any time in nature at all knows that some changes are good, some changes are bad. You know, when a leopard eyes you hungrily, maybe you shouldn't go with the flow. Maybe you should resist the flow. And it's true in society as well. You know, the Holocaust is a classic example. And how many Germans had been taught to obey so much from birth that, you know, the first time a tyrant comes along and starts giving them orders, they're like, oh, well, I have to follow orders because that's what I do. That's the infantilized mind at work, thinking that I have a right and a duty and an obligation to obey. As Hannah Arendt says, no one has a right to obey. We are all required to evaluate every order and every change and decide for ourselves if this is a good thing or a bad thing, and decide how to engage with it and be prepared to engage actively. And if we're not, we create, you know, disasters. But we're living in a society that even after the Holocaust still cultivates this passivity in people, this expectation that if they'll just let their betters decide for them what you know, how the world should work, you know, and they just pay their taxes and go to their job, well, then they can live a little comfortable life and they don't have to worry their pretty little heads over all these things that are happening. It's the perfect circumstances for corruption, you know, to say I don't have a duty to watch the watchmen. They'll just honestly be virtuous because that's who they are. You know, I just read last week for the first time Bambi, and you know, Disney has us all thinking Bambi is this cute little story about forest animals, or if we've actually watched Bambi, we think it's a mostly cute story about forest animals that has some grim moments. But the author, Felix Salten, was a Viennese Jew, and he was writing during World War II. The original, there's a new translation of it from Jack Zipes that's well worth reading. I read it and I was blown away by it. It is an exploration of what's wrong with the culture that would allow something like that to rise to power. But it's all expressed in terms of just a deer being born and growing up and learning how to live in a forest where there's hunters who periodically come and murder them without any seeming warning or explanation. And how do you get out of the mindset of just passively going with the flow until you're shot and get to the point where you learn to be an adult and think about the dangers in the world as the way an adult should? It's really powerful. It's quite interesting. And it goes right to what you're saying, Stephen. It's you know, these issues people have been wrestling with for a while. Is why do we let our society drift into the direction of getting us so focused on comfort and being infantilized and passive, when we know from history where that leads? It doesn't lead anywhere good.
Bambi meets Godzilla.
Yeah, right. The follow-up. Thanks, Stephen. Donald, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, I'd just like to maybe assign some work to Ari if he doesn't mind. Somewhere he's drawing on somebody's.
I don't mind work. I don't mind work.
What you give a very expansive reading of Gödel's theorems, and I'd like to just know what sources you're pulling on for that. I'll give you my background. I was a philosophy and math major in graduate school. Midterm exam in mathematical logic, two of the questions were prove those damn theorems. And I distinctly remember, because it was a great honor for me. I was the only one that had the proofs right. So at one point, I could prove those theorems. But nobody went into, oh my God, civilization is falling, you know? you know, that all attempts to describe reality must fail, you know, which doesn't mean that reality fails. Reality is complete, and right. It's our formal systems that have limitations.
Yes.
And we live with those. and that while we can construct so-called Gödel truths in arithmetic systems that show these properties, there is no test that says, here's a statement, is it a Gödel truth or not?
Right.
Nope, there isn't one.
Right.
A mathematician or a logician has either come up with a proof or he hasn't, in which case it's undecided. It's, you know, apart from the Gödel statements that he generates, which show that what his theorems are true. And his I don't know. I'll have to say, Ari, that sometime in the recent past, and by that I mean the last decade or so, I actually found that copy of that test. I can't even read the notation in which my proof is presented.
I would love to see it, by the way. I don't know how you would get it to me.
No, I don't know. I don't know what it had to do with part of a class, something in modeling theory or something. It was not. I've studied Gödel's original construction using arithmetic and how he maps all the operators of arithmetic and then generates his number, and how he encodes the rules of arithmetic. But that was not what we used in this class.
Oh,
we
okay.
had it was a more modern proof where somebody said, "Oh yeah, Gödel's got it right here," but man, he spent a lot of time when you could just quickly do this proof, knowing that it was true. It was much easier to prove something the second time. But there are many people that expound on what these proofs might mean, you know, and what their domain is, how they extend to language or physics or any other system that strives to be an axiomatic system. And I feel that you've gotten a very expansive interpretation from somewhere, and I would just like to.
Oh yeah,
I would just like you to post a book or something, and
yeah.
He did.
I'm gonna share it. It's Rebecca Goldstein's
Oh, okay.
Incompleteness, and she's just give a 30-second or less about her book. I forget, it was probably at Princeton where she met Kurt Gödel, and she was studying there in basically the same things you're studying, math and philosophy, and so she does this whole really investigative thing on him. So the book about him, but then his response to basically Wittgenstein and their interactions, which are very limited. But the idea is it's a really beautiful narrative going into the philosophy of the time and how he was a dedicated Platonist and how he was really trying to prove logical positivism as false, right? He wanted to actually expose how it was wrong because he had this faith in Platonic forms. And so her whole book is this sort of narrative based around that. And if you like this stuff, I have a feeling you'd really love this book. It was really exciting, especially for someone who's into this. It was really great because it also talks about one of the reasons I want to talk about so much, just a little bit here at least, is that it really argues for what's generally thought of as Gödel's theorems and what they're doing and Wittgenstein's doing. And she tries to say that all of this generalization, almost like the passive form of accepting or putting these things into a pre-existing framework, is how it's sort of cannibalized. And Gödel and Wittgenstein are like smacking themselves on the forehead because their theorems and their ideas are being really misunderstood in the exact opposite way that they wanted them to be done. So it's like, I almost think of like the thing we talked about a long time ago, but like what a dinosaur is, and then someone's using the term dinosaur for a political party that's dying, and they're like, oh, I like dinosaurs. They're like a bones and fossils. You're like, dude, a total misunderstanding of what the word and the thing was supposed to be doing. So most of my expansiveness is, I would say, 90% of trying to reframe or recapture what she was saying in that book, and the other 10% of it is stuff that I forget his actual name, but the YouTube channel Veritasium does on these things, and he has a great video called "The Hole in the Middle of Math." I'm sure you can find that someone real
I
fast.
think I've watched it. I think I've watched it.
Yeah, it's fantastic, right? And so,
But mathematicians haven't all gone out and slit their wrist,
yes,
and said,
yes.
"Oh crap, it's over." Einstein didn't say, "Well, Kurt, I think there's a problem with general relativity." I mean.
Well, you're familiar with Kurt. Kurt used, instead of using which I'm actually more interested here, is Kurt used essentially a palentropos of time through cyclical time, almost a teleology involved of time, to use this cyclical language of time to reprove the relativity theory. And he showed it to Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein loved it. And it's famous that these guys used to walk in Princeton every day.
Oh yeah,
right?
I've seen
You're familiar with this.
I've seen film. It's on
right, yeah.
TV specials. Him walking,
yeah,
talking.
Yeah.
Einstein finally met someone who was smart enough to have an interesting conversation with him.
Yeah, and weird enough to get along, right? So,
I mean, I'm not denying that they were close or talked or anything like that. I think that's very clear.
Yeah, no, I was just pointing out that Gödel used basically his way of thinking to reprove relativity, but not through linear time, but through cyclical time, which a lot of physicists now want to believe. This is why, almost like the idea of a reoccurrence, where 2 points in time can map onto each other and become the beginning becomes the end and the beginning. Like you can go around like you can in space to get to the same place. You can go around in time to get the same place in time.
Be careful, you'll wake up Stephen and he'll talk about Nietzsche again.
Oh, I would love that. I love it when Stephen talks. Anything I can do to get him going, it's fantastic. It's like my favorite nutrition.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Well, I've got this book. I mean, I'm not. This is not a challenge. This is a request for a source for me to go study. When we looked at it in this logic class, it was, there's.
Well, I'll throw it back.
This is a very important result.
Donald, you should read this book and tell me how much you disagree with it. I would
love
to hear.
I don't know that I'm. My memories from 50 years ago were, it's like they're dimming.
Well, this is it's a great philosophy book. So I have a feeling, based on the narrative of it and just the ideas, it will trigger a lot of things that you'll just be like, intuitively, I agree or I disagree. I'd love to hear what you think about this book, even outside of this group.
The reason I say ask is because I've heard people go on, they say, about Gödel's incompleteness theorem, that there are theorems we can't prove, therefore we're justified in having faith in God because it's okay, and I go like, well, not quite, but it's clear we're not going to discuss it, because if that's the leap you took, there's nothing I'm going to be able to say, like climb back up the cliff,
Yeah.
But I think what you've said is serious.
Yeah.
And therefore I'd like to pursue it. I know I've discussed this with my math professors, and they would go over and how they look at their axiom systems and attempt to reduce them. They're completely fine with unprovable true statements, as long as they're not fine with if someone shows that their axiom systems proves inconsistencies, can prove A and not A, they say, well, that's a bad axiom system, and they throw that out. They look at Gödel quite seriously, cautioning about the fundamentals of mathematics, but they don't say, oh shit, there's nothing we can do. Let's just give up. No, there are domains in which they can work and work soundly. And
Oh,
they
yeah.
accept that we may not have a mathematical model that encompasses everything from
Yeah,
a consistent axiom set.
sure.
And
I'll make a
so,
quick response to this about the leading from, because everybody, almost including me, misinterprets Gödel's incompleteness theorem to get stuck what's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. You learn just enough about something to think you know everything about it. Like, oh, it's incomplete, therefore God exists. You're like, dude, there is so much more you need to learn. This is just the next step, right? Don't think that you know this, now you know everything, right? It's more like for me, the humility is here that I should embrace my ignorance, that I have a lot more to learn, as opposed to now I know everything, right? As Stephen will say, that I have this great idea. Well, now I want this idea to be everything and everywhere. Like, well, ideas have a tendency to do that, but you got to keep them in check. That they have their limits, and they're always So
well, you know, we're almost getting to philosophy here, Ari. So I think we should go back to just lightly reading this text.
But yeah, he gave us the name, so it's there in the chat. Donald, you want to copy that out of the chat? Rebecca Goldstein, Incompleteness.
Yeah.
That's the book.
And I highly recommend the book. It was really, really fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you, Ari.
Thank you both. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, what's on my mind is, I guess, how we fall into a passive relationship to the world. I'll first begin by saying that the way I understood the terms are opposite of what you understand. The reality talks about things as they really are, and actuality is our construct. Given that situation, actuality, in some sense, at least in a cultural setting, in many ways is much more powerful than reality. It's like actuality is bearing down on us. We understand the pressure that it puts us on us. I'll first mention that when I was a visiting artist back at San Jose State, where I went to school before I went to Berkeley, I was very young, I think very early 30s. And the museum, or the really wasn't a museum, but the art director of the gallery for the whole university was about my age. And we became, I wouldn't say friends, but we certainly were acquainted with each other, and we trusted each other to talk seriously. And one day I went to her and say, how come all the exhibitions are so bad? Now she did retort back and said, oh, that's your opinion. I think they're just wonderful. She didn't say that. She kind of agreed, like, so she started making excuses like, oh, yeah, I'm the director, but there's the dean, there's a gallery committee, there's the outside social committee, there's the provost. It's like, all that pressure, like you have to make a compromise and do what you can in that situation. And so I said, oh, then you're selling out. Meaning, you are the gatekeeper for what is really good in art. And she agreed that obviously it wasn't very good. She was apologetic, but she made all sorts of excuses. But when I said, oh, then you sold out, she corrected me immediately. She said, I did not sell out, I bought in. I bought into the system, right? Because that's the pressure makes it that you're either going to stand pat and defend the aesthetics in art because you're the gatekeeper, or you're gonna buy into the system because the system has a lot of weight and a lot of pressure, right? And so most of us are forced into not selling out, but buying in to the system. And so we are therefore must obey the rules in, as best we can without jiggering it too much, because what happens? So the next thing I'll go to is that there was a very, very good demonstration of this in, I think, May 14, 1989. What the what is it? The Tiananmen Square massacre. Well, hope was spurring alive, particularly the students. They wanted to, in a sense, have a more freedom to express themselves, sort of like they were making a kind of democratic movement in a way. And I think the mayor of Shanghai, which was a fairly liberal guy and understood that, tried to plead with them. It's like, oh, don't push with this any further because bad things are going to happen. And I think the mayor was eventually arrested and put away. And so what happened was, by the way, Xi Jinping, no, not Xi Jinping, uh, oh, whatever his name is, you know, he was the guy that actually created this relationship with the United States after Mao died. And he rode in the tanks and literally slaughtered them, you know. After he just made a deal with the students and everybody else, because there was not only students, but there was farmers and everybody joining in, coming to Tiananmen Square. And said, if you just stop all this movement, I will promise to create prosperity. So they were bought off. Keep quiet, let us handle the politics. We'll make you rich and wealthy. And that's what he turned out to have done, you know. And China just made this boom, and particularly when it went into the World Trade Organization, and they really emerged, right? But of course, during that emerging, of course, the state created more and more control over the system. So now, when things are breaking down, in other words, the promise is being broken because people could clearly see that the economy is falling apart. The promise has been made for them to buy into the system. They no longer want to buy into the system. But anybody that wanted to protest or whatever, they got put away. You don't know what happened to them. There could be live, organ harvesting for all sorts of things, or they're put in prison forever, but they get silenced. That is why people buy into the system, even in a very, very terrible situation, because there's just too much pressure to rebel against the system when it gets out of balance. And so no excuse is made for them in that sense, except if you were in that same position, you either have the choice to keep quiet or fight for what is right, at least in your thinking, or you're going to disappear and you're all going to be harvested and sold to the market. That is tyranny. And I think that we get to a point where every society, to a certain degree, have a structure that indoctrinates us into buying into the system. So please do not bear down on these people any more than you need to, because they have bought into a system, despite the fact maybe they shouldn't. But should they pay for their lives for not buying in? and just understood that the buying in is in fact selling out. That's my answer to Stephen. That's it. It's a very, very tough world. Okay, that's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, I mean, when a society wants to pacify its citizens, it doesn't just give them milk and cookies. These discussions often talk about, oh, these people are so soft. They're just namby-pamby and they just want everything the way they want it. But frequently there's guns and clubs and gas involved. And it doesn't have to be deployed every time, as long as the people making the decision today remember the last time it was deployed and are thinking about that at some level. They're like, yeah, I don't think I want that to happen to me. So I'll just go along and hope for the best. I've watched organizations like the Office of Information Technology and the Department of Veterans Affairs. I've watched what happens when that kind of totalitarian decision-making approach takes over, in which policies can't be questioned, everybody just has to obey. And people who 10 years before were directly talking to the caregivers and making decisions about the architecture of the software, they get backed into a corner where they just have to do what the policy says, even if they think it's wrong, because I mean, the alternative is not good. They don't want it. They don't want it to happen to them. So what they do is they take their heart and their spirit out of their work and they just go with the flow and they count the days until they retire. They say, when I retire, then I can be a person again. I'll be allowed to, have agency. But until then, I have to just be safe, because it's not safe to try to buck that system when it's still. So I thank you for reminding us of that. It's something Utah Phillips said about democracy and voting. So people think democracy and voting is a great thing. And he's not saying it couldn't be a great thing. He says, but the way we do it is tyranny of the majority. The people who are outvoted, if they don't go along with the majority opinion, then they get the police and the military aimed at them. It's violence, is what it is. You think that a vote doesn't matter. You try breaking a law that the people voted into place in front of a police station and see what happens to you. And you will discover that it's violence. It's violence used to impose the will of the majority upon the minority that couldn't keep up with them. And that it's one of the interesting features of the English language that we can't distinguish that kind of democracy, which Aristotle criticized, from the kind where the majority doesn't impose violence and is just trying to make the best governance decisions they can. To us, the same word covers both things. And again, it goes back to that issue. We can't distinguish poison from food. We use the same word for both effectively. I'm going to call on Ari in a second, but first I'm going to dump some text again, like we did at the opening minutes of this session. We haven't gone through any of the text, and if Sharon were here, she would be going, I'm going to take us back to the text. So part of what I thought was interesting about this is that these opening 5 sentences of paragraph 3 really go after, they really explore what Stephen was talking about. This is about, when religion takes the form of creating a mandate that human beings mentally grow up and spiritually come alive and dilate their minds to encompass more than just obedience, more than just rote catechism. If we have to actually think about these issues and engage with them in our lives and figure out how to, bring these better behaviors to life, then they are activating. They encourage agency. They encourage the adult forms of taking responsibility. But if it goes and he ties it, what he's tying it to in sentences 1 and 2 is he's showing us how, if Jesus the teacher is irrelevant, there's a brand of Christianity that says the only important thing about Jesus is that he can save us from hell. So if you follow the catechism and you do the rote things, then you get to go to heaven. And that's why Jesus is important, all important, because who wants to be tortured? And they never say it like that, but that's the core, value proposition. The people who do it that way, what they're saying is there's no point in trying to learn his lessons from him about how to be a decent human being, because he's a god. So he can be good because he's divine and immortal, but you can't be good because you're mortal. It's your only hope is salvation. You have to hope that he rescues you from hell. It's that or nothing, or you're doomed. And that brand of Christianity might be really helpful for, you know, constructing authoritarian governments, but it's not good for creating a population that can avoid being infantilized and pacified. So if you need to look at Jesus as a teacher who you have to listen to, you have to think about what he's saying and figure out how to apply it to your life, because if he's a human being who's being good, then it proves that other human beings can be good. And maybe you could be good, but you would have to get off your ass and do something. You'd have to actually engage with the world as an adult. You see the difference, right? Is there an insuperable chasm between what Jesus is saying and our choices in our lives? If there's an insuperable chasm, then you need salvation from hell. But if he's a human being, it's not insuperable. It's not uncrossable. It's a chasm that we could grow step by step to learn how to cross. And then that becomes incumbent upon us to engage in that life's work. So that's the alternative, more spiritual side of Christianity that in the medieval epoch was in that tug of war for the soul of Christianity. Which was it going to be? Is it your money or your life, you know, with the cross or the sword of Charlemagne? Or is it, you know, you need to engage consciously with these issues and grow up as a human being, which goes back to the Jewish tradition of, the way that you engage in the Jewish faith isn't by, rote catechism. It's by wrestling with these issues your whole life. You really think about this stuff and you work on it. The activating form of religion. And I was noticing this. I was thinking about this while we were talking for the last 2 hours, because David shared that slide from the philosophy of Kenneth Smith, on which I'd put the quote from Kenneth. There are only two kinds of philosophy, just as there are of religion. I'd forgotten that clause. There are only two kinds of philosophy, just as there are of religion: existentialist and escapist. And that's highly relevant to this discussion in these paragraphs, right? Because the kind that says there's no point even bothering to try, just get your get out of hell free ticket, is an escapist religion. And that's the fundamental dogmatic one that's burning people at the stake for not complying. We're sending Charlemagne and his armies out to burn the groves and ransack all the gold and bring it back for the Pope. But side by side with that, you have the spiritual tradition, which is going the other way and saying, no, these things that have been said make demands upon us to mature and grow up and think about these things. We can't just be infants hoping for the best. We have to learn how to intelligently and wisely apply these lessons in our own behavior and our own lives. That's an existentialist approach. Doesn't have all the answers. Doesn't have rote memorization. It requires a more adult interaction with the religion and with the literature. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, this is very nice. Yeah, I'm mostly thinking about it really ties together really nicely, this whole thing about what Stephen was saying, essentially not being a slave to the group and just being passive to the group. And you have to be an individual. And the way Phil is talking about this tension of buying in is necessary. And I wanted to maybe reframe this or take it to the higher level multi-dimensional aspect of it being a dialectic of philanthropy. And I'm going to reference Jonathan Sacks, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, his work overall. All of these do this, but his last work before he died, Morality, Restoring Common Good in the Divided Times, kind of to change his language slightly to retranslate into the language that we use here, is he's saying morality. He defines morality as a relationship or a tension, specifically a philanthropy between the I and the we, and that morality is a system that gives you sophro sune to balance between the I and the we, and how they're both necessary to bring each other into being. And I feel like this is what Blake is really saying about Christianity here, Christendom, that he says, especially at the last, I don't know which sentence is, but it's man has to be cultured into spirituality and cannot attain it in one fell swoop. This is essentially saying that in order to access spirituality, you have to access the power of the group, but you still need to be an individual within the group in order to do the spirituality. And this is really this idea: you can't buy into the point where you sell out, and you can't just not buy in at all. right? You have to buy into some degree, and essentially, like again, the nice thing that Rabbi Sachs talks about the Jewish tradition is that we believe that we're partners in creation. That's what it means to be the image of God, is that He made space for us to be, and then we make space for Him to be by recognizing the sacred other in all other life that exists, and essentially making this distinction between these things, but also unifying them by making distinctions. And this is what it means to be holy in Judaism: is you make something distinct, but then you keep it in its place, but then you unify it within a sense of a essentially like a palentropy. These two things bring each other into being. And what I'm really focusing on here is this idea of, well, he specifically says the whole problem with modern society is we've just gone to being eyes, where we're essentially strangely both infants, but not in the group anymore. That we're so passive, we're so doing whatever we do, that we're just infantilized, and we don't do the group anymore. The common good is gone. There is no shared sense of anything, and essentially we've gone with outsourcing based from the market and democracy, that you've outsourced all these things that individuals should have held on to, essentially forms of memory that now is just put out to the society. So you're it's like a weird, again, strange paradox in reverse here, that by being completely passive with the group, you're completely selfish, and and the whole thing falls apart, that you just have individuals only caring about their own selfish small needs. And he talks about specifically, which was something that I wanted to reference here that's kind of new. The one thing that he likes to talk about is at the same time in history, you have Alexis de Tocqueville in America and Charles Darwin doing his thing, and they essentially come to very similar conclusions about this. And the Darwin point of view is much easier to say than to Tocqueville, so I could save de Tocqueville another time. But essentially, Darwin has this idea of selfish genes, which is an overreduction through, I forget the modern famous neo-Darwinist who says he wrote the book Selfish Genes, but essentially that individuals through survival of adaptivity and survival of the fittest, that the selfish person reproduces, and there is no room for altruism and self-sacrifice in this sort of survival of the fittest mentality, because it's like if you have two people that are both there's a predator, and one of them says, hey, I'm going to protect us both, and the other guy says, I'm going to run away. Well, the guy that protects us both dies, and the guy who runs away survives and reproduces. So there would be no self-sacrifice for groups. And so Darwin, in his book called The Descent of Man, which he wrote specifically afterwards to fix this problem, says that humans, or all organisms, but essentially humans, reproduce as individuals, but we survive in groups. And groups that have altruism, which where you have people sacrifice themselves for the group then survives, and then the majority of those people pass on their genes. And so I was thinking, this is the dynamic in the palentropy between the we and the I. The I reproduces through its own genes, but the we allows the I to survive as a group. And I feel like this is where much Blake is getting on, and Kenneth Smith is really getting on, is this tension between the I and the we, and how to navigate this relationship through a series of, I don't know exactly what to call it, like both a narrative and a bunch of rules, but really just an understanding, a framework to how to cultivate Sophrosyne, so that you can sort of not get too reduced into the I or the we.
Yes, yes. I love it. I love it, Ari. That's right. He's that's exactly the lines he's going along. And I particularly appreciate your walkthrough of the correction that Darwin makes on the descent of man and the problem that he saw. Because you get modern writers who don't see the problem, which is funny because okay, so they've read one of Darwin's books. How about they read more of them? The story continues, right? I mean, it's like cherry picking Nietzsche, and you can make him say anything, but if you see the whole picture, it's a more humane picture, where he's talking about the need to overcome our own bad ideas, not just other people's bad ideas, as Nietzsche overthrows his own previous bad ideas. There's this. I'm really interested in writers who take a journey mentally and are willing to confront, the errors and what they've seen before, and what they've said before, and what they've believed before. this is it's a point I've been thinking about between the seminars from time to time. It's easy to overlook. If philosophy is used as a tool to tear down other people's arguments, then it's not philosophy, it's sophistry. It's just a debating tool. That's of minor value, if any. The main value of philosophy is to give you the ability to find the problems in your own beliefs and get out of the trap that those beliefs represent by, by incorporating what has been excluded, by making visible what has been marginalized and invisible, and learning from that to come up with a new, greater, sorry, Hegel, a new, greater synthesis that can take more of the world, the real natural world, into account than what we believed before. So it's part of what I love about the descent of man. And hardly anybody talks about it, Ari. Thank you for bringing it up. That there's Darwin refining his ideas in a critical way that's lost on so many people. I threw in the Henry David Thoreau quote about the majority of one in there too, just to keep running with the motif. Phil, tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I want to respond to what Ari said. I really like what he said, but I think my statement will underscore that in its way. As I told this meetup, I've been an unabashed supporter of Ukraine, and not that I have a huge donation, but I'm consistently giving money to them because they were struggling for something, and something went wrong, and I can't seem to make the connection to donate. So I wrote to them, and they wrote back, and like there's something wrong with transportation and communication. And I said, one of the problems I find with the structure, maybe from their end, was the Ukraine Relief Fund was wrapped up in a global relief fund on its own, and I have the suspicion, and I'm not going to accuse them of doing so, that in a sense that they're diverting some of the money to the global relief fund. And I understand that, the world is in a lot of trouble. And I wrote to them, I said, yeah, the world is suffering. A lot of people are suffering in the world, even including in the United States. And the reason I had chosen to give to Ukraine was that I made a distinction. They're willing to fight for their cause. That in a sense, there's a difference between pathos and suffering. Pathos is when you willing to absorb the suffering and yet struggle for your existence. Where suffering is just like, like I need help. I do understand that. I'm not, I'm not sort of like hard-hearted to that. But I thought at this moment was very, very important is that Ukraine exhibit the concept of pathos. They are suffering as much as anybody else, but they're not going to give up and they're going to fight for their rights. And that made a difference. And so I explained that to them, and they'll say, well, we'll try to make sure that your relief fund only goes to Ukraine, right? I'm still waiting to see whether my ability to, give them through my credit card will work. But my credit card says that we never got the message that you gave money, so it's from the other end. So I said, please try to fix that because there seemed to be a problem from your end rather than my end. Okay, that's it. So I think we have to make a distinction. Who the hell do we help when the world is in a lot of trouble? And the world is in a lot of trouble. There's a lot of people that are suffering that doesn't deserve to suffer. But there is a difference between those people who will fight for what is right and for what is right for them, but also right for certain other values that I actually agree with. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. So here we wrap up. We come to the end of our 3 hours for this week. Today's session was unusual. Until the very end, we didn't actually talk about the text. And it's because we had the delight of having some new folks like Gene on. And so we sort of took the opportunity to do a bit of a retrospective top level summary on some of Kenneth Smith's core ideas and some of the things we've talked about here. And I don't doubt there will be more of that as Gene returns, and it's good to do these retrospectives. But I will be aiming, if I can, to take us back to the text next time and see if we can move ahead a little. Thanks again, everybody, for participating. I had a lovely time.
Promises, promises, promises. All right.
We didn't have Sharon to keep goading us on.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All
Bill,
Highlight of the week. Thanks so much, everybody. Highlight of the week.
Thanks,
Hey,
Harry.
hey, Donald, send me your email address so I could
no,
send you
I just
something.
blindly PayPal money into Ukraine. I have no idea where it goes. No, no, I do get answers.
Well, I don't use PayPal. Maybe that's the problem. Okay.
All right.
Send me your email so I could correspond something with.